Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. The cupboard smelled of dust and Vernon's old shoes, and Harry Potter pressed his face against the rough wood of the door, trying to make the hollow ache in his stomach stop twisting. 3 days now. 3 days since Uncle Vernon had shoved him inside with nothing but a jar of water that had run empty yesterday morning. It had been an accident. It always was. At school, when Tommy Stevenson had pushed him down in the playground and called him a freak again, Harry had just wanted the bigger boy to stop. He hadn't meant for Tommy's shoelaces to tie themselves together, hadn't meant for the boy to fall face first into the mud puddle. But magic didn't care about Harry's intentions. Magic just happened, wild and strange and terrifying, and now Harry was paying the price. "Freakish boy," Uncle Vernon had snarled when the school rang to report the incident. "Making trouble again with your unnaturalness." The belt had come out first, as it always did. Then the shouts. Then the cupboard door slamming shut with a finality that made Harry's chest tight with panic. No breakfast tomorrow, no lunch, no dinner, just darkness and hunger and the sound of the Dursleys eating their meals in the kitchen, the clink of cutlery against plates, taunting him through the thin wall. Harry was 6 years old, and he understood that he was broken in a way that made the people who were supposed to care for him angry. Aunt Petunia's lips went thin and sharp whenever she looked at him, like she was tasting something bitter. Dudley kicked him when his parents weren't looking, because Dudley had learned that Harry was safe to hurt. And Uncle Vernon looked at Harry like he was a problem that needed solving, permanently. But Harry didn't know that 3 streets away, someone else was watching. Dobby crouched in the shadow of the neighbour's garden shed, his large green eyes fixed on the narrow window of number 4, Privet Drive. His bat-like ears twitched at every sound from within the house, cataloguing the movements of the family that had become his obsession. The house elf was very good at not being seen. It was a skill his kind had perfected over centuries of service, the ability to exist without existing, to observe without being observed. But Dobby was not supposed to be here. Master Lucius had given no orders about watching the Potter boy, as Master Lucius cared nothing for Harry Potter beyond the occasional sneer about the precious little celebrity who had defeated the Dark Lord. Yet here Dobby was, night after night, drawn by something he could not name and dared not examine too closely. The boy had been missing from school for 3 days. Dobby had watched the yellow bus come and go without stopping, had seen the postman hesitate at the front gate before moving on. The house radiated a particular kind of stillness that spoke of secrets locked away. Dobby's massive ears flattened against his skull. He had served dark wizards for all his life. He knew what cruelty looked like, knew the weight of it in the air like smoke from a dying fire. And number 4, Privet Drive, reeked of it. The fat man, Vernon Dursley, had returned from work an hour ago, his face purple with some fresh rage. Through the kitchen window, Dobby could see him gesticulating wildly at his wife, his thick finger stabbing toward what Dobby knew was the cupboard under the stairs. The woman nodded, her horsey face set in lines of rigid disapproval. Their son bounced in his chair, excited by the drama, reaching for another biscuit from the tin his mother had placed safely out of reach of smaller, hungrier hands. But there were no smaller hands at the table. The Potter boy was elsewhere. Dobby's webbed fingers pressed against the rough wooden fence, and he felt his magic respond to his distress, tiny sparks dancing between his fingertips like angry fireflies. This was wrong. This was all wrong. The boy who had saved the wizarding world was being treated worse than a house elf, and that was saying something indeed. Master Lucius would be furious if he knew where Dobby was spending his evenings. "That Potter brat is no concern of ours," he had said more than once, usually after reading something in the Daily Prophet that set his teeth on edge. "Let Dumbledore coddle his precious weapon. The boy will learn soon enough that fame is nothing without proper breeding." But Dobby remembered the night the Dark Lord had fallen. He remembered the wild celebrations in the wizarding world, the tearful relief of witches and wizards who had finally, finally been freed from fear. And he remembered the whispers about how it had happened. A baby's sacrifice, a mother's love, magic older and deeper than anything the Dark Lord had understood. Harry Potter had saved them all, and this was how the wizarding world repaid him. The kitchen light went out. Through the gaps in the curtains, Dobby watched the Dursleys settle into their evening routine, Vernon in his chair with the television blaring, Petunia with her gossip magazines, Dudley sprawled on the carpet with his toys spread around him like treasure. A normal family, to all appearances, content and safe in their suburban paradise. None of them spared a glance for the cupboard under the stairs. Dobby's magic pulsed again, stronger this time, and he found himself moving before he had consciously decided to do so. House elf magic was not bound by the same rules that governed wizards. Walls and wards meant little to creatures who had been designed to appear and disappear at a master's whim. The Dursley house opened to him like a flower, welcoming him into its shadows. The cupboard was worse than he had imagined. It was smaller than the pantry at Malfoy Manor, where they stored the winter preserves. The ceiling sloped so low that even a 6-year-old boy could not stand upright. There was a thin mattress on the floor, stained and smelling of neglect, and a few broken toys that looked like they had been discarded by someone else. Spider webs thick with dust draped the corners like funeral shrouds, and in the middle of it all, curled into a tight ball of misery, was Harry Potter. The boy was smaller than Dobby had expected, smaller and thinner, with bones that showed sharp beneath skin that rarely saw sunlight. His famous lightning bolt scar was hidden beneath an untidy fringe of black hair, but even in the darkness, Dobby could see the bruises that mottled his arms like ugly flowers. The child was unconscious, whether from exhaustion, hunger, or simply the body's merciful retreat from suffering. Dobby could not tell. But he was alive, still breathing, still fighting, still here, despite everything that had been done to him. Dobby's large eyes filled with tears that he did not try to stop. In the wizarding world, this boy was legend. The boy who lived, the child who had triumphed over the darkest wizard in generations and brought peace to their world. Songs were sung about him in the pubs. Stories were told about his courage, his power, his destiny. None of those stories mentioned that he was 6 years old and sleeping in a cupboard. Master Lucius tells Dobby to protect the family's interests, he whispered to himself, his voice barely more than a breath in the stifling darkness. Master Lucius says the Malfoys must think of their position, their reputation, not their future. The boy stirred slightly, making a small sound of distress that cut through Dobby like a blade. But what is good for the Malfoys if the boy who lived dies in a cupboard? Dobby continued, his voice growing stronger as the logic crystallized in his mind. What happens to the wizarding world if Harry Potter is lost? What happens to Dobby's family if the Dark Lord's followers return because their enemy was destroyed not by dark magic, but by neglect? It was a thin justification, and Dobby knew it, but it was enough. Just enough to satisfy the magical bindings that tied him to his master's service while allowing him to act on the moral imperative that was tearing at his chest like claws. The boy deserved better. The boy deserved to live. And if the wizarding world would not save him, then perhaps a house elf could. And Dobby reached out with one trembling finger and touched Harry Potter's shoulder. The child's eyes opened immediately, wide and green and bright with fear. He scrambled backward as far as the tiny space allowed, pressing himself against the wall with the desperation of prey that had learned to expect pain from every contact. "Please," the boy whispered, and his voice was hoarse from crying and thirst. "I didn't mean to do it. I'll be good. I won't be strange anymore, I promise." Dobby's heart broke cleanly in two. Harry Potter need not make promises to Dobby, he said gently, keeping his voice low and soothing. Dobby is not here to hurt the great Harry Potter. Dobby is here to help. The boy blinked, his young face struggling to process the appearance of a creature unlike anything in his limited experience. Are you real?" "Dobby is very real," the house elf assured him, "and Dobby is very sorry that this has been done to you. But Harry Potter must not be afraid. Dobby has come to take you away from this place." Away? The word was spoken with such desperate hope that Dobby had to close his eyes for a moment to maintain his composure. "Away," Dobby confirmed, "to somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere no one will hurt you ever again." Harry Potter stared at him for a long moment, his green eyes searching Dobby's face for signs of deception or cruelty. Finding none, he began to cry, not the harsh sobs of fear or pain, but the quiet tears of a child who had just been offered something he had never dared to dream of. Hope. Chapter 2. The Great Escape. Harry had never seen anything like the creature sitting across from him in the cramped cupboard. It was smaller than Dudley, but somehow seemed ancient, with enormous green eyes that gleamed with kindness Harry had almost forgotten existed in the world. The thing, Dobby, he had said his name was Dobby, spoke in a strange, careful way that made Harry think of the way Aunt Petunia talked when the neighbours came to visit. Like he was trying very hard to be proper. "Harry Potter must not be frightened," Dobby said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The cupboard was so small that they were almost touching, but somehow Dobby's presence made the space feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. "Dobby knows this is very strange for you. But Dobby promises that everything will be all right." Harry wiped his nose on his sleeve, a gesture that would have earned him a sharp slap from Aunt Petunia. But Dobby only looked sad, like Harry's tears were hurting him too. "Are you going to take me away?" Harry asked. The words came out in a rush, desperate and hopeful, and terrified all at once. "Really away? Not just to another cupboard somewhere?" Dobby's ears flattened against his skull, and for a moment his enormous eyes blazed with something that might have been fury. But when he spoke, his voice remained gentle. "There will be no more cupboards for Harry Potter," he said firmly. "No more hunger. No more locked doors. Dobby swears this on his own magic." Harry didn't understand what that meant, but something in Dobby's tone made him believe it anyway. "Where will we go?" "To a castle," Dobby said, and his face lit up with the first smile Harry had seen in the tiny space. "A beautiful castle with tall towers and moving stairs and a ceiling that shows the stars. Harry Potter will have a room of his own there. A proper room, with windows and books and everything a boy could want." A castle. Harry's mind, fed on fairy tales from the few picture books at school, seized on the word with desperate hope. Castles were where princes lived, where knights were brave and dragons were defeated, and everything ended happily ever after. Harry didn't think he was a prince. Princes didn't live in cupboards. But maybe there could still be a happy ending. "But first," Dobby continued, his expression growing more serious, "Dobby must be very clever about this. The people who put you here, they must not know where you have gone. They must think you ran away by yourself, like a brave boy who was very tired of being hurt." Harry nodded eagerly. The idea of Uncle Vernon not knowing where he was, not being able to reach him or hurt him, was almost too wonderful to believe. Dobby began to move around the tiny space with surprising efficiency, gathering Harry's few possessions, the broken toy soldier that had been his only companion, the thin blanket that smelled like dust and sadness. With a wave of his hand, the items folded themselves neatly into a bundle that seemed too small to contain anything at all. "Magic," Dobby explained when he saw Harry staring. "Dobby will teach Harry Potter about magic someday, when he is ready. But for now, we must hurry. Magic." And the word sent a thrill through Harry's chest that had nothing to do with fear. He had always known he was different, had always felt something stirring inside him when he was angry or scared or sad. The strange things that happened around him, flowers blooming out of season when he touched them, Bully's shoelaces tying themselves together, his hair growing back overnight after Aunt Petunia cut it. Maybe they weren't bad things after all. Maybe they were magic. Dobby pressed a finger to his lips, listening intently to the sounds from the house above. The television was still blaring in the sitting room, punctuated by Uncle Vernon's occasional grunts of approval or dissatisfaction. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The sounds of a family that had no idea their unwanted burden was about to disappear forever. "Now," Dobby whispered, "but we must be very quiet and very quick." He reached out and took Harry's hand, and Harry was surprised by how warm and solid Dobby's fingers felt. Real. Not a dream born of hunger and desperation, but something actual and true, and here to help him. The world twisted. That was the only way Harry's 6-year-old mind could make sense of what happened next. One moment they were in the cupboard, surrounded by the familiar smells of dust and neglect, and the next they were standing on soft grass under a sky so dark and star-filled it took Harry's breath away. The air was different here, cleaner somehow, and tinged with something that made his skin tingle in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. And before them, rising out of the darkness like something from the very best sort of dream, was a castle. Harry's head tilted back so far he nearly lost his balance trying to take it all in. Towers stretched toward the stars, their windows glowing with warm golden light. Flags fluttered from the highest peaks, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of water lapping against stone. It was enormous and ancient and beautiful, and it looked exactly like the castles in the picture books at school, except bigger and more real, and somehow alive in a way that made Harry's chest tight with wonder. "It's really real," he breathed. Dobby beamed at him with such pride you would have thought he had built the castle himself. "Very real. This is Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, the greatest magical school in Britain, and the safest place in all the world for boys like Harry Potter." School. Harry's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. School meant other children, and other children meant teasing and pushing and being called a freak. But then he looked at the castle again, at its impossible towers and glowing windows, and thought that maybe a school that looked like this might be different from the grey brick building where he spent his days dodging Dudley's friends and their cruel laughter. "Will I have to go to classes?" he asked hesitantly. "Not yet," Dobby assured him. "Harry Potter is too young for classes. But someday, when he is ready, he will learn wonderful things here. How to make feathers fly and teacups dance, and flames that burn but do not hurt. He will learn that the magic inside him is not strange or wrong, but beautiful and powerful and his own." They began walking toward the castle, Harry's small hand still clasped firmly in Dobby's. The grass was soft beneath his feet, and with each step the castle seemed to grow larger and more magnificent. As they drew closer, Harry could see that the windows weren't just glowing. They were filled with movement, shadows that might have been people going about their evening routines. "Are there other children here now?" Harry asked. "Not now," Dobby said. "It is summer, so the students are at home with their families. But in a few weeks, they will return, and the castle will be full of laughter and learning and life. Harry Potter will see them sometimes from his special room, but they will not see him, not until he is ready. A secret room in a castle." Harry's imagination, already working overtime, seized on this with delight. He would be like a hidden prince, watching the world from his tower, safe and warm and free. They reached what appeared to be a side entrance to the castle, though Harry couldn't see any door in the smooth stone wall. Dobby approached it with confidence, pressing his palm against a particular stone that looked identical to all the others. The wall shimmered like water, and suddenly there was an archway where none had been before. Magic again. Harry was beginning to understand that magic was not just about flying teacups and growing hair. Magic was about possibilities, about the world being stranger and more wonderful than he had ever dared to dream. They climbed a winding staircase that seemed to go on forever, past portraits that Harry could have sworn moved when he wasn't looking directly at them, past suits of armor that gleamed in the torchlight. Oh, the castle was warm inside, warmer than number 4 Privet Drive had ever been, and it smelled like old books and beeswax candles, and something else that Harry couldn't identify, but that made him feel safe. Finally, Dobby stopped in front of what looked like a blank stretch of wall on the 7th floor. He began pacing back and forth in front of it, his lips moving silently, as though he were reciting something to himself. Back and forth, 3 times in total. On the 3rd pass, a door appeared. It was a beautiful door, made of warm wood and brass fixtures that gleamed like gold. But what made Harry gasp was not the door itself, but what lay beyond it when Dobby pushed it open. "Welcome to your new home, Harry Potter," Dobby said softly. Or the room that greeted them was everything a 6-year-old boy could have wished for, and more. It was large, larger than the Dursleys' entire downstairs, with windows that looked out over the castle grounds. There was a proper bed, with soft blankets and pillows that looked like clouds, a desk with paper and coloured pencils, bookshelves filled with picture books and stories, and toys scattered about in cheerful disarray. A fire crackled merrily in a fireplace that was taller than Harry himself, casting dancing shadows on walls that were painted with murals of forests and meadows and soaring birds. But best of all, in the centre of the room was a table set with more food than Harry had seen in his entire life. There were sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, and bowls of soup that steamed invitingly, and plates of biscuits and cakes and fruit that gleamed like jewels in the firelight. There was milk in a pitcher that was covered with dancing cows, and juice that sparkled ruby red in crystal glasses. The smell of it all, warm bread and honey and roasted meat and sweet things he couldn't even name, made Harry's empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. "For Harry Potter," Dobby said, gesturing toward the feast with obvious pride. "Dobby has asked the castle to provide everything a growing boy needs. Eat as much as you want. There will always be more." Harry approached the table like it might disappear if he moved too quickly. He reached out tentatively to touch one of the sandwiches, half expecting to be slapped away as he always was when he reached for food that wasn't meant for him. But Dobby only smiled encouragingly. "Eat. Or Harry Potter, you are safe here. This is your food, in your room, and no one will take it away from you." The first bite was revelatory. The bread was soft and fresh, the meat tender and flavorful, the cheese sharp and creamy all at once. Harry ate with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned that meals could be interrupted at any moment. But as the minutes passed, and no one came to snatch the food away, he began to slow down, to actually taste what he was eating. It was wonderful. All of it was wonderful. When he finally looked up, stomach pleasantly full for the first time he could remember, he found Dobby watching him with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Why are you sad?" Harry asked, alarmed. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Dobby said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, Harry Potter has done nothing wrong. Dobby is not sad. Dobby is happy. Very, very happy that Harry Potter is safe and fed and home." Home. The word settled over Harry like a warm blanket. He looked around the beautiful room, his room, and for the first time in his short life, he began to understand what that word truly meant. "Will you stay with me?" he asked, suddenly afraid that this wonderful creature who had saved him might disappear as suddenly as he had arrived. "Dobby will stay," Dobby promised solemnly. "Dobby will take care of everything. Harry Potter need never be afraid or hungry or alone again. This is Dobby's promise, and house elves never break their promises." Harry didn't know what a house elf was, but he believed Dobby with every fibre of his being. For the first time in 6 years, or Harry Potter fell asleep, not in a cupboard, but in a real bed, with a full stomach and a guardian who had risked everything to save him. And in the warmth and safety of his new home, Harry began to dream not of punishment and pain, but of magic and possibility, and the wonderful life that was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The missing boy. Albus Dumbledore felt the wards snap at precisely 3 minutes past midnight. The sensation jolted him from sleep like ice water in his veins. A sharp, discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of protective magic he had woven around number 4, Privet Drive. For 5 years, those wards had hummed with quiet constancy, fed by Lily Potter's sacrifice and anchored by her sister's blood. They had never failed. They had never even flickered. Until now. What Dumbledore was out of bed and reaching for his wand before his mind had fully processed what he was feeling. The blood ward was intact. He could sense its steady pulse, strong as ever. But something vital had been severed. The connection that told him Harry Potter was safe within his aunt's home had gone suddenly. Absolutely silent. His fingers trembled slightly as he conjured his travelling cloak. In 65 years of practicing magic, Albus Dumbledore had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. The Dursley house sat in darkness when he arrived, its suburban facade as smugly ordinary as ever. But Dumbledore's enhanced senses could detect the wrongness immediately. The way the shadows seemed too deep, the silence too complete. He approached the front door with the careful steps of a man who had spent decades navigating disasters, his wand held ready but concealed beneath his robes. The door was locked, of course. Vernon Dursley was nothing, if not predictably paranoid about home security. But locks had never posed much of an obstacle to one of the most powerful wizards in Britain. A whispered, unlocking charm, and Dumbledore stepped into the narrow hallway that smelled of furniture polish and suppressed resentment. He found the cupboard under the stairs immediately. The door hung open, revealing the tiny space that had served as Harry Potter's bedroom for the past 5 years. Dumbledore had known about the cupboard, of course. His monitoring spells had mapped every inch of the house. But he had told himself it was temporary, a regrettable necessity. The boy needed to understand hardship to prepare him for the greater trials that lay ahead. Looking at it now, at the thin mattress and the cobwebs and the scratch marks on the inside of the door where small fingers had clawed at the wood, Dumbledore felt something cold and unpleasant settle in his stomach. "He's gone." The voice from behind him was sharp with barely controlled fury. Dumbledore turned to find Petunia Dursley standing in the hallway, her thin face pale, and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Behind her, Vernon loomed like a purple-faced mountain, his small eyes darting nervously between Dumbledore and the open cupboard door. "When?" Dumbledore asked quietly. 3 days ago. Petunia's voice cracked slightly. We thought he was hiding somewhere, playing one of his freakish tricks. But he hasn't come out for meals. And his things..." She gestured helplessly at the empty space. Dumbledore stepped into the cupboard, his tall frame folding awkwardly in the confined space. His wand cast a soft light that revealed the full extent of Harry's living conditions, the stained mattress, the broken toys, the water stains on the walls. With growing horror, he began to piece together the timeline. 3 days. Harry Potter, the most famous child in the wizarding world, had been missing for 3 days, and no one had thought to contact him. "You kept him locked in here," he said, and his voice was so quiet it was barely more than a whisper. Vernon stepped forward, his face flushing an even deeper shade of purple. "Now see here, old man. That boy was nothing but trouble from the day you dumped him on our doorstep. Now freakish things happening all the time, frightening Dudley, making the neighbors talk. We did our best with him, but some people just can't be helped. Your best." Dumbledore's blue eyes had gone cold behind his half-moon spectacles. "You kept a 6-year-old child in a cupboard and called it your best." "He was fed," Petunia said defensively, though her voice lacked conviction, "and clothed, and we sent him to school like we were supposed to. What more did you expect us to do?" What more, indeed? Dumbledore closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment pressing down on his shoulders like stones. He had placed Harry here believing that Petunia's blood would be enough to keep him safe. He had monitored from a distance, for trusting that family bonds, however strained, would ensure the boy's basic welfare. He had told himself that a difficult childhood would make Harry strong, would prepare him for the challenges he would face as a young man. He had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. "We need to find him," he said finally, emerging from the cupboard with careful dignity, intact despite the circumstances. "I'll be contacting the ministry immediately. Until then, you will speak of this to no one. Is that understood?" The Dursleys nodded eagerly, relief flickering across their faces at the suggestion that this might not become public knowledge. Dumbledore looked at them for a long moment, memorizing their expressions, and wondered what kind of man he had become that he had trusted these people with something so precious. By dawn, the search had begun in earnest. Minerva McGonagall stood in the Dursleys' sitting room, her lips pressed into a line so thin they had nearly disappeared entirely. She had arrived 20 minutes after Dumbledore's urgent summons, and spent the first 10 of those minutes systematically inspecting every inch of number 4, Privet Drive. What she had found had left her speechless with rage. "Albus," she said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury, "when you placed Harry with these people, did you perform any monitoring charms beyond the blood ward?" Dumbledore, who was pacing the length of the room with uncharacteristic agitation, paused in his movement. "I monitored his safety, Minerva. The wards would have alerted me to any immediate physical danger." "Immediate physical danger?" McGonagall's voice was flat. "And what, or pray tell, did you consider immediate? Because I can tell you right now that the boy has been systematically underfed, isolated, and emotionally terrorized for years. The magical traces in that cupboard tell a story of a child in constant distress." "I know." The word seemed to cost Dumbledore considerable effort. "I know, and I will carry the responsibility for that for the rest of my days. But right now, our priority must be finding him." McGonagall studied her colleague's face, searching for the man she had known and respected for decades beneath the weight of his obvious guilt. Where do we even begin? A 6-year-old child, alone in the world? Albus, the possibilities are terrifying. He's not entirely without resources. Dumbledore's tone was carefully neutral. Harry has considerable magical ability, even at his age. The incidents the Dursleys described suggest a level of accidental magic that could help him survive, at least temporarily. Or get him killed. McGonagall's words hung in the air between them like a curse. Accidental magic from a distressed child is unpredictable at best. If he's encountered muggles— "I've already contacted Kingsley Shacklebolt," Dumbledore interrupted. "He's coordinating with the Aura Department to begin a systematic search of London. Muggle authorities have been alerted to watch for a young boy matching Harry's description, though obviously we've had to be circumspect about certain details." McGonagall nodded grimly. The International Statute of Secrecy meant that the full resources of the magical world could not be brought to bear openly, but there were ways to work within the system. What about other magical families? Surely someone might have taken him in. "That's what I'm hoping." Dumbledore's expression grew thoughtful. "There are still those in our world who remember what Harry did for us, if he was found by the right people." A sharp knock at the front door interrupted them. Through the lace curtains they could see the unmistakable silhouette of a ministry official, formal robes and all. McGonagall raised an eyebrow at Dumbledore, who sighed heavily. "Kingsley works quickly," he murmured, moving toward the door. "Let's hope his efficiency extends to finding answers." 300 miles north of Privet Drive, Harry Potter was discovering that books could move. He had been exploring his new room with the careful thoroughness of a child who had learned to extract every drop of joy from rare moments of freedom. The shelves that had appeared overnight, he was fairly certain they hadn't been there when he fell asleep, were filled with volumes that seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Pictures that waved at him from their pages, words that shifted and changed when he concentrated on them too hard. "It's magic," Dobby explained, appearing beside the bed with his characteristic pop of displaced air. He was carrying a breakfast tray that smelled like heaven, eggs and bacon, and toast with real butter, and a glass of orange juice that sparkled in the morning light streaming through the windows. "All of it?" Harry asked, accepting the tray with wondering eyes. Even after a night of sleep and a full stomach, he still couldn't quite believe that the food was really his. "All of it." Dobby settled onto the chair beside the bed, his large eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Magic makes everything better. Harry Potter will see. Magic makes books that teach themselves, and pictures that move, and rooms that know exactly what you need before you ask for it." Harry took a bite of egg and chewed thoughtfully. "Are there other people like you? Other magic people?" "Oh yes," Dobby said, practically bouncing in his seat. "Thousands and thousands of magic people. Witches and wizards who can make flowers bloom with a wave of their hand, and fly through the sky on broomsticks, and talk to animals, and heal hurts that would never get better otherwise. And they're all nice like you?" The question was so innocent, so trusting, that Dobby felt his heart crack a little. How could he explain to this child that the wizarding world was just as capable of cruelty as the Muggle one? That there were magical people who would hurt Harry not in spite of his fame, but because of it? "Most of them are good," he said carefully. "Most of them would be very happy to meet Harry Potter and keep him safe. But some—" He paused, searching for words that would inform without frightening. "Some magic people have forgotten how to be kind. That is why Harry Potter must stay hidden for now, until he is big enough and strong enough to protect himself." Harry nodded solemnly, as though this made perfect sense to his 6-year-old logic. "Will you teach me to do magic?" "Dobby will teach Harry Potter everything Dobby knows," the house elf promised solemnly. "But first, Harry Potter must eat his breakfast and grow strong. Magic needs strength to work properly." As if summoned by his words, one of the books on the shelf fluttered open, its pages turning to reveal illustrations of young witches and wizards learning their first spells. Harry watched in fascination as the figures moved through their lessons, wands tracing patterns in the air that left trails of golden light. "That will be Harry Potter someday," Dobby said softly. "Learning proper magic at the greatest school in the world, with friends his own age, and teachers who will help him become the wizard he was meant to be." "When?" Harry asked, though he didn't sound particularly eager to leave his magical sanctuary. "When you are 11, Dobby said. "All magical children go to school when they are 11. Until then, this room will be your home, and Dobby will be your family, and you will be safe and happy and free to grow into the remarkable person you already are." Harry leaned back against his pillows, breakfast tray balanced on his lap, and looked around the room that had been crafted specifically for him. Sunlight streamed through windows that showed him a view of rolling grounds and a lake that sparkled like diamonds. Books whispered stories to each other on their shelves. Toys that moved on their own accord waited patiently for his attention. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged. "Nothing," Kingsley Shacklebolt said, his deep voice heavy with frustration. "We've searched every magical household in London, contacted every known sympathizer to the Potter cause, and put out alerts to every Aura station in Britain. It's as if the boy simply vanished into thin air." The emergency meeting had been called for that evening, bringing together the core members of what had once been the Order of the Phoenix. The group was smaller now, some lost to the war, others retired to quiet lives they hoped would remain undisturbed. But those who remained were united in their determination to find their missing hero. "What about international contacts?" Emmeline Vance suggested from her seat near the window. "There are those on the continent who would be honored to provide Harry with sanctuary." "Already contacted," Dumbledore said wearily, "as the responses have been universally negative. No one has seen hide nor hair of a young boy matching Harry's description." Remus Lupin looking older and more worn than his years should have allowed, leaned forward in his chair. "Albus, I have to ask, are we certain this was a rescue rather than an abduction? There are still Death Eaters unaccounted for, still those who might wish to use Harry for their own purposes." The silence that followed this suggestion was heavy with implications no one wanted to voice. The idea that Harry Potter might have been taken by those who served his parents' killer was too horrible to contemplate. "The magical traces at Privet Drive suggest otherwise," McGonagall said finally. "Whatever removed Harry from that house was careful, methodical, and remarkably gentle. If Death Eaters had taken him, I doubt they would have bothered to pack his few belongings or stage the scene to look like a voluntary departure." "Then who?" The question came from Arthur Weasley, whose own young children had made him particularly sensitive to the fate of orphaned boys. Who in our world has both the skill to bypass Dumbledore's wards and the motivation to take such a risk? It was, Dumbledore realized, the right question. The Blood Ward remained intact, which meant that whoever had taken Harry either possessed magic powerful enough to circumvent his protections, or had found a way to extract the boy without technically violating the terms of his placement. Both possibilities suggested a level of magical sophistication that narrowed the field of suspects considerably. "We continue the search," he said finally, "and we hope that whoever has Harry truly has his best interests at heart. Because if they don't—" He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Somewhere out there, the boy who lived was beyond their reach and their protection. And until they found him, the entire wizarding world would sleep a little less peacefully. High in his tower room, Harry Potter slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who was finally, completely safe. Dobby sat beside his bed, one webbed hand resting gently on the boy's forehead, feeling the steady rhythm of peaceful dreams. Below them, the castle dreamed too, ancient stones humming with contentment at having a young life to shelter once again. The Room of Requirement had outdone itself, creating not just a sanctuary, but a home, complete with everything a growing boy could need to thrive. And in London, in a dozen different locations, some of the most powerful witches and wizards in Britain continued their desperate search for a boy who was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he needed to be. Chapter 4. Adaptation and Learning. 3 weeks had passed since Harry Potter had vanished from Privet Drive, and the change in him was nothing short of miraculous. Gone was the hollow-cheeked, frightened child who had huddled in cupboards and flinched at raised voices. In his place sat a boy with bright eyes and steady hands, perched cross-legged on his bed, while morning sunlight streamed through windows that showed him a world he was only beginning to understand. His face had filled out with regular meals. His shoulders had straightened without the constant weight of fear, and when he smiled, which was happening more and more often, it transformed his entire being. "Good morning, Harry Potter," Dobby said, appearing with his customary soft pop and a breakfast tray that smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. "Dobby hopes you slept well." "I dreamed about flying again," Harry said, accepting the tray with the easy familiarity of routine. 3 weeks of consistent kindness had taught him that food would come when promised, that gentle voices meant safety, and that the creature who cared for him would never deliberately cause him harm. Dobby's ears perked up with interest. "Flying dreams are very good dreams for young wizards. Perhaps Harry Potter will fly for real someday." "On a broomstick?" Harry asked, spreading marmalade on his toast with careful precision. His table manners had improved dramatically under Dobby's patient guidance, not through criticism or punishment, but through gentle demonstration and the simple luxury of unhurried meals. "On a broomstick," Dobby confirmed, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot for their morning conversations. Harry Potter's father was a wonderful flyer, the best seeker Hogwarts had seen in 50 years, they said. Harry paused mid-bite, his green eyes lighting up with the eager curiosity that had emerged as his constant fear receded. "Tell me about him. About my father." This had become their morning ritual. Breakfast, accompanied by carefully edited stories of James and Lily Potter, now crafted by Dobby to give Harry pride in his heritage without burdening him with the darker truths he was still too young to bear. In Dobby's version, James Potter had been a brave wizard who fought against bad people to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Lily Potter had been brilliant and kind, with magic so powerful she could make flowers bloom with just a touch. James Potter was very much like Harry Potter, Dobby said warmly. Curious about everything, quick to laugh, and impossibly brave when it mattered. He met your mother at school, you know. She thought he was too proud at first, but he proved himself worthy of her attention through many small kindnesses. How? He helped younger students who were being picked on by bullies. He rescued a cat that had gotten stuck in a very tall tree. He once spent an entire evening helping an older student with their Transfiguration homework, even though he could have been playing Quidditch with his friends instead. Harry absorbed this information with the intense concentration he brought to all of Dobby's stories about his parents. In the absence of any real memories, these tales had become precious treasures, polished smooth by repetition and cherished far beyond their simple content. Were they happy? Harry asked, as he always did. Very happy, Dobby assured him, as he always did. They loved each other very much, and they loved you most of all. Everything they did to keep you safe and make sure you would grow up to be the wonderful person they knew you could become. After breakfast came lessons, though Harry didn't think of them that way. To him, while they were simply the most fascinating part of each day, time spent with Dobby learning about the extraordinary world that lay beyond his room's walls. Today's lesson began with reading, as most of them did. The Dursleys had sent him to school, of course, but they had never bothered to help him with his homework or ensure he was keeping up with his classmates. Dudley's superior performance, achieved through tutoring and parental attention, had been just another way to demonstrate Harry's inferiority. But Dobby had discovered that Harry was actually quite bright when given proper instruction and encouragement. "What does this word say?" Dobby asked, pointing to a particularly challenging word in the picture book they were working through together. Harry studied it carefully, sounding out the syllables with growing confidence. "Or transfiguration. Very good. And what do you think transfiguration means?" "Changing one thing into something else?" Harry guessed, looking at the illustration of a wizard turning a desk into a pig. Exactly right. Transfiguration is the branch of magic that deals with changing the form or appearance of something. It is very difficult magic that requires great concentration and skill. Harry nodded solemnly, filing this information away with all the other magical concepts Dobby had introduced to him. Magic, he had learned, was not just about waving a wand and making things happen. It was an entire discipline with rules and techniques and different specialties, as complex and varied as the Muggle world he had always known. "Will I learn transfiguration when I go to school?" he asked. "Or Harry Potter will learn transfiguration and charms and potions and defense against the dark arts," Dobby confirmed. "He will learn to make feathers dance, and teacups grow legs and mice turn into snuff boxes. He will discover that magic is even more wonderful than he imagines." The mention of school always brought a small flutter of nervousness to Harry's stomach. The idea of being around other children again, of having to navigate friendships and rivalries, and all the complicated social dynamics he had never quite mastered, was both exciting and terrifying. But Dobby always seemed to understand his concerns without being told. "The children at Hogwarts are different from the children Harry Potter knew before," he said gently. "They understand about magic, and they know that being different can be wonderful instead of frightening. What many of them will want to be Harry Potter's friend." "Because I'm famous?" Harry asked. This was another concept Dobby had introduced gradually, the idea that his survival of something terrible had made him important to the magical world. Harry didn't fully understand it yet, but he was beginning to grasp that his lightning bolt scar marked him as someone special, Because Harry Potter is kind and brave and interesting, Dobby corrected. The fame will make them curious, but his character will make them stay. After reading came what Dobby called magical theory, informal lessons about how magic worked and what it could do, usually conducted while Harry played with toys that moved on their own, or drew pictures with crayons that changed colors at his touch. What these sessions had revealed something remarkable. Harry's accidental magic was becoming less accidental. Where once his emotions had triggered wild, uncontrolled bursts of power that left him exhausted and frightened, Harry was now beginning to direct his magic with something approaching intention. When he wanted a toy that was out of reach, he could sometimes make it come to him. When he was cold, his blankets would wrap themselves around him more snugly. When he was particularly excited about something Dobby was showing him, the lights in the room would brighten, as if responding to his mood. Magic responds to emotion, Dobby explained, as they watched Harry's teacup refill itself, without any conscious effort on the boy's part. Happy magic, sad magic, angry magic. They all feel different and do different things. Harry Potter's magic is very strong, and it wants to help him be comfortable and safe. Is that normal? Harry asked, staring at his cup with wonder. For Harry Potter, yes. You have more magic than most wizards will ever possess, even when they are grown up. That is part of what makes you special. The afternoon brought story time, Harry's favorite part of each day. Dobby would settle into his chair, while Harry curled up on the bed with whatever stuffed animal the room had provided that week, and together they would explore tales of magical adventure and heroism. Some were from the books that appeared on Harry's shelves, but the best ones were the stories Dobby told from memory, tales of brave wizards and clever witches, of magical creatures who became unlikely friends, as of children who discovered they had extraordinary gifts and used them to help others. It was during one of these story sessions that Harry laughed for the first time. Dobby had been telling him about a young wizard who tried to impress a girl by transfiguring his pet toad into a prince, only to discover that the toad had very strong opinions about being changed without permission, and spent the rest of the story seeking elaborate revenge on his owner. The image of a dignified prince toad chasing a terrified wizard around a ballroom, demanding an apology in a voice that still croaked, struck Harry as the funniest thing he had ever heard. The sound that escaped him was rusty at first, as if his laughter had gone unused for so long it had forgotten how to work properly. But then it bubbled up from somewhere deep in his chest, bright and genuine, and filled with the kind of joy that Dobby had begun to fear the boy might never experience. Dobby stopped mid-sentence, his large eyes filling with tears as he watched Harry dissolve into helpless giggles. This was not the nervous laughter of a child trying to please, or the sharp bark of derision he had occasionally heard from the Dursleys. This was pure, uncomplicated happiness, and it transformed Harry's face so completely that for a moment Dobby could see exactly what he would look like when he was older, and the last shadows of his difficult childhood had finally lifted. "Harry Potter has a beautiful laugh," Dobby said softly when the boy finally caught his breath. "Do I?" Harry asked, wiping tears from his eyes. "Aunt Petunia always said I was too loud." "Aunt Petunia was wrong about many things," Dobby said firmly. "Harry Potter's laugh is exactly the right volume for Harry Potter. Dobby hopes to hear it many more times." And indeed, as the days passed, laughter became a regular part of their routine. Harry laughed at Dobby's stories, at the antics of his enchanted toys, at his own attempts to pronounce difficult magical words. He laughed when he successfully made his quill write his name in sparkly purple ink, and when a particularly ambitious attempt to levitate his breakfast resulted in scrambled eggs on the ceiling. Each laugh seemed to lighten something in his chest, to chip away at the careful walls he had built around his heart. The room itself seemed to respond to Harry's growing happiness. The new wonders appeared daily. A rocking horse that galloped around the perimeter when Harry climbed aboard, a set of building blocks that constructed elaborate castles on their own, a collection of picture books that told different stories depending on Harry's mood. Most remarkably, when Harry expressed curiosity about real books like the ones the older students at his Muggle school carried, an entire library materialized along one wall. It was not the vast, intimidating collection that existed in Hogwarts proper, but a child-sized version filled with volumes appropriate for a bright 6-year-old. Books about magical creatures with pictures that moved and made sounds. Simple histories of the wizarding world told through stories rather than dry facts. Beginning guides to magical theory written in language Harry could understand. "The room knows what you need," Dobby explained as they explored the new addition together. "It can sense that Harry Potter's mind is growing hungry for knowledge, so it provides knowledge for him to consume." "It's alive?" Harry asked, running his fingers along the spines of the books with reverent curiosity. "In a way, yes. The room has been part of Hogwarts for a very long time, and it has learned to care for the students who need its help. Right now, it cares very much about keeping Harry Potter happy and safe." 300 miles south, in a commandeered conference room at the Ministry of Magic, that same care was manifesting as a source of increasing frustration for some of the most powerful wizards in Britain. "Still nothing," Kingsley Shacklebolt reported to the assembled group, his voice heavy with exhaustion. 3 weeks of intensive searching had yielded exactly 0 leads, despite the involvement of every available aura and the cooperation of magical governments across Europe. "We've expanded the search to include France, Germany, and Ireland. The Irish Ministry has been particularly helpful. They've checked every magical household with children and come up empty." Dumbledore sat at the head of the table, looking older than his considerable years. The past 3 weeks had aged him visibly, etching new lines around his eyes and bowing his shoulders with the weight of responsibility he couldn't escape. What about non-traditional magical families, squib communities, families that exist on the fringes of our society? "Checked," Arthur Weasley said from his position near the door. "I've personally visited every family on the Ministry's registry of magical Muggle liaisons. No one has seen anything remotely resembling Harry Potter." "Werewolf packs," Remus Lupin suggested quietly. As someone who straddled the line between the magical and mundane worlds, he understood better than most how easy it could be for someone to disappear into the spaces between societies. "Mooney, I've checked every pack from here to Scotland," came the reply from Sirius Black, who had been granted temporary release from Azkaban to assist in the search for his godson. 3 weeks of freedom had done little to restore his appearance. He remained gaunt and wild-eyed, driven by a guilt that made Dumbledore's own seem manageable by comparison. "Nothing. It's like the boy never existed." McGonagall, who had said very little during these increasingly desperate meetings, finally spoke up. "Albus, I think we need to consider the possibility that Harry is no longer in Britain, or—" She paused, clearly struggling with the words. "Or that he's no longer alive to be found." The silence that followed this suggestion was deafening. It was the fear that haunted all of them, the possibility that their searches were futile, because there was nothing left to find. "The blood wards remain intact," Dumbledore said quietly. "As long as they continue to function, we know that Harry lives." This had been the one consistent mystery throughout their search. By all rights, the protective magic anchored by Petunia Dursley's blood should have failed the moment Harry left her care permanently. The fact that it continued to pulse with steady strength was both reassuring and baffling. "How is that possible?" Emmeline Vance asked. "You've said yourself that the magic requires Harry to be able to call Privet Drive home. If he's been gone for 3 weeks—" "I don't know," Dumbledore admitted, and the word seemed to cost him considerable effort. "The magic should have failed by now. The fact that it hasn't suggests either that Harry intends to return to the Dursleys, which seems unlikely given the circumstances of his departure, or that something else is sustaining the ward." "Something else like what?" Sirius demanded, his voice sharp with barely controlled desperation. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes distant as he considered possibilities he had been reluctant to voice. "Magic leaves traces," he said finally. "Particularly powerful magic, or magic performed with strong emotional intent. If someone with sufficient skill were to study the ward itself. He trailed off, but McGonagall understood immediately. You think whoever took Harry might have found a way to maintain the ward artificially, to keep us from knowing he was truly gone? It would require extraordinary magical knowledge, Dumbledore said, and a level of foresight that suggests considerable planning. But yes, it's possible. The implications of this settled over the room like a shroud. If someone had been clever enough to maintain the blood ward while removing Harry from its protection, they were dealing with the opponent far more sophisticated than they had initially assumed. As someone who understood not just how to circumvent Dumbledore's protections, but how to turn them into a weapon of misdirection, we continue searching, Dumbledore said finally, his voice carrying more weariness than authority. But I fear we may be pursuing shadows, while the substance of our hope grows ever more distant. In his tower room, blissfully unaware of the despair his absence was causing, Harry Potter was discovering the joy of reading by firelight. Curled up in his favourite armchair with a book about a young witch who befriended a dragon, he practised sounding out words while Dobby darned socks with methodical precision. "Dobby," Harry said suddenly, looking up from his book. "Are you happy?" The question was so unexpected, so artlessly genuine, that Dobby nearly dropped his needle. "Is Harry Potter happy?" "Yes," Harry said without hesitation. "Very happy. Happier than I've ever been. But I was wondering if you're happy too. Taking care of me, I mean. It must be a lot of work." Dobby set down his sewing and looked at the boy who had become the centre of his existence. This child who asked about his feelings, who thanked him for every meal and every story, who had learned to trust so completely that he fell asleep without fear. "Dobby has never been happier," he said truthfully. "Taking care of Harry Potter is not work. It is the greatest privilege of Dobby's life." Harry smiled at this, the bright, unguarded smile that had become Dobby's favourite sight in all the world, and returned to his book. Outside, night was falling over the grounds of Hogwarts, and somewhere in the distance, the search for a missing boy continued, but in the room of requirement there was only warmth and safety, and the quiet contentment of a child who was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he belonged. Chapter 5. The Room's Secrets. 6 months had transformed Harry Potter in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had known him during his cupboard years. Where once there had been a frightened, undernourished child who spoke in whispers and flinched at sudden movements, there now sat a confident boy with bright eyes and proper posture, his dark hair neatly combed, and his clothes, conjured fresh each day by the room's mysterious magic, clean and well-fitting. He had grown taller, though that was to be expected of any 6-year-old given regular meals and adequate sleep. More remarkably, he had grown eloquent. The halting, careful speech patterns of a child afraid to draw attention to himself had given way to the natural chatter of someone who had learned that his thoughts and questions were welcome. Dobby had proven to be an excellent teacher, and Harry had proven to be an eager student. "The room feels different today," Harry announced, looking up from the elaborate castle he was constructing, with blocks that assembled themselves according to his increasingly detailed mental blueprints. Quieter, somehow, like it's thinking very hard about something. Dobby, who was mending a tear in one of Harry's favourite books, The Adventures of a Young Wizard Who Befriended a Phoenix, paused in his work to consider this observation. Over the months, he had learned to take Harry's intuitive understanding of their magical environment seriously. The boy had developed an almost uncanny sensitivity to the subtle shifts in the room's consciousness, often noticing changes days before they became apparent to Dobby himself. "What kind of quiet?" Dobby asked, setting down his needle and thread. Harry tilted his head, clearly searching for words to describe something beyond his normal vocabulary. "Like when you're trying to remember something that's very important, but also very old. That sort of quiet." This was precisely the kind of perceptive comment that had begun to make Dobby wonder if Harry's magical development was proceeding rather more rapidly than either of them had anticipated. 6 months of emotional stability and consistent magical education had allowed the boy's natural abilities to flourish, and the results were becoming increasingly remarkable. Where his accidental magic had once been wild and uncontrolled, Harry now demonstrated what could only be described as intuitive spellcasting. He could summon objects to his hand with a focused thought, change the color of his clothes by concentrating on what he wanted to wear, and influence the room's manifestations with increasing precision. Just yesterday, he had managed to conjure a small rainbow above his bed, simply because he had been feeling particularly happy and thought it would be pretty to look at. Perhaps Harry Potter would like to explore what the room is thinking about, Dobby suggested carefully. He had been waiting for the right moment to introduce Harry to some of the room's more advanced capabilities, and the boy's obvious curiosity seemed to indicate that the time might be right. Harry's eyes lit up with immediate interest. Can we do that? Explore the room's thoughts? In a way, yes. The Room of Requirement has been part of Hogwarts for many, many years. It has seen thousands of students come and go, and sometimes, if you concentrate very carefully, you can glimpse the memories of those who needed its help before you. This concept fascinated Harry beyond measure. The idea that the room held within itself the experiences of other children, other people who had sought sanctuary or assistance within these walls, struck him as wonderfully mysterious. "How do we see them?" he asked, abandoning his block castle entirely. "Very carefully," Dobby cautioned. "And only if the room decides to share. Memories are precious things, and not all of them are meant for everyone to see." Harry nodded solemnly, as understanding that this was important magic that required respect and caution. Dobby had taught him that the most powerful magic often came with the greatest responsibility, and Harry had learned to approach new magical experiences with appropriate seriousness. They moved to the center of the room, where Harry settled into a cross-legged position on the soft carpet. Dobby positioned himself nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to allow Harry the space he needed to concentrate. "Close your eyes," Dobby instructed softly. "Feel the room around you. Feel how it breathes and thinks and remembers. When you're ready, ask it very politely if it would like to share some of its memories with you." Harry closed his eyes and let his awareness expand beyond his own small body. And this was a meditation technique Dobby had taught him weeks ago, initially as a way to help him control his accidental magic, but increasingly as a method for connecting more deeply with the magical environment around him. The room's consciousness was vast and warm and incredibly ancient. Harry could feel layers upon layers of memory and experience, stretching back through decades of students who had needed help, comfort, or simply a place to be alone with their thoughts. It was like touching the mind of a very old, very wise friend who had seen everything and judged none of it. "Please," Harry whispered, his voice barely audible, "could you show me some of your memories? I promise I'll be respectful." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Images flooded Harry's mind with startling clarity. Not his own memories, but the room's recollections of the people it had sheltered over the years. He saw students from different eras, their clothing and hairstyles marking them as belonging to different decades, all united by their need for sanctuary. A girl with braids and old-fashioned robes, hiding from bullies while she practiced spell work that had been deemed too advanced for someone of her year. The room had provided her with advanced textbooks and a space where she could experiment safely. A boy with worried eyes, pacing back and forth while he rehearsed a speech he needed to give to the Hogwarts governors. The room had manifested a replica of the Great Hall, complete with an audience of supportive portraits. A group of older students huddled around a map, planning what looked like an elaborate prank. But the room had provided them with everything they needed: materials, tools, even a schedule of the teachers' movements. Dozens of other memories flickered past, each one a testament to the room's endless capacity for compassion and assistance. Harry felt privileged to witness these moments, these glimpses into the private struggles and triumphs of young people who had walked these corridors long before he was born. But then the memories shifted, becoming darker and more disturbing. Harry saw a boy who couldn't have been much older than himself, though his eyes held a coldness that made Harry's skin crawl. Unlike the other students, whose needs had been innocent, or at least harmless, this boy radiated something that felt fundamentally wrong. He moved through the room with predatory purpose, and examining its offerings with the calculating gaze of someone looking for weaknesses to exploit. The boy was handsome in a sharp, cruel way, with dark hair slicked back and features that would have been pleasant if not for the malicious intelligence behind them. He wore Hogwarts robes, but everything about his posture and expression suggested someone who considered himself above the rules that governed everyone else. Harry watched in growing unease as the boy began experimenting with the room's responses, making increasingly disturbing requests. Weapons appeared at his command, knives and poisons and devices designed to cause pain. Books materialized that seemed to radiate malevolence, their pages filled with knowledge that Harry instinctively understood was dangerous. Most disturbing of all was the way the room itself seemed to recoil from the boy's presence. Unlike the warm cooperation it showed to other students, the room's responses to this particular visitor were reluctant and fearful, as if it were being compelled to provide assistance against its own better judgment. The memory reached its climax when the boy carefully concealed something within the room's depths, a small, dark object that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Harry couldn't see what it was clearly, but the very sight of it made him feel sick and frightened, in a way he hadn't experienced since his earliest days with the Dursleys. The boy smiled as he hid his treasure, and Harry woke from the vision with a gasp, his heart racing and his hands trembling. "Harry Potter!" Dobby was beside him instantly, his large eyes wide with concern. "What did you see? You were making distressed noises." "There was a scary boy," Harry said, his voice small and shaken. "He was mean to the room. He made it help him with bad things, and then he hid something terrible here. Something dark and wrong." Dobby's reaction was immediate and alarming. His ears flattened completely against his skull, his eyes went wide with what could only be described as terror, and he began wringing his hands in agitation. "Describe this boy," Dobby said urgently. "Tell Dobby exactly what he looked like." Harry did his best to recall the details, though the memory of those cold eyes made him shudder. He was young, but not as young as me. Maybe 10 or 11? Dark hair, very neat. Handsome, I guess, but in a way that made me want to hide. And his eyes— Harry struggled to find the right words. His eyes were like a snake's, cold and hungry, and completely empty of anything good. Dobby made a sound that was part whimper, part moan. He began pacing frantically, muttering to himself in a language Harry didn't recognize, his agitation growing with each step. "Dobby, what's wrong?" Harry asked, alarmed by his guardian's obvious distress. "Who was that boy?" "Dobby cannot— Dobby should not." The house elf was clearly struggling with himself, torn between his desire to protect Harry from disturbing truths and his need to ensure the boy understood the gravity of what he had witnessed. That boy grew up to become a very dark wizard, Harry Potter, the darkest wizard of all. Dobby cannot speak his name, but Harry Potter must understand that this is very dangerous knowledge. Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Is he still alive? The scary boy?" "No," Dobby said quickly. "No, he's gone. Harry Potter's parents made sure of that. But the things he left behind." He gestured vaguely toward the walls of the room, and Harry understood that whatever the boy had hidden was still here, somewhere in the space they called home. As if responding to their conversation, the room itself began to change around them. The cheerful decorations that had adorned the walls for months began to fade, replaced by protective symbols that Harry didn't recognize but could sense were powerful. The air grew thick with defensive magic, and the very walls seemed to shimmer with protective enchantments. "The room is trying to protect us," Dobby said, some of his panic giving way to wonder. "It remembers what was hidden here, and it doesn't want that darkness to touch Harry Potter." "Can we get rid of it?" Harry asked. "Whatever he left behind, can we make it go away?" "Dobby does not know," the house elf admitted. "Such things are beyond Dobby's knowledge. But perhaps," he looked thoughtful for a moment, "perhaps when Harry Potter is older and stronger, when he has learned more about magic and how to protect himself, perhaps then he might be able to do something about the darkness that was left behind." Harry nodded, accepting this as he accepted all of Dobby's explanations about things he was too young to fully understand. But the encounter with the room's darker memories had left him feeling unsettled and strangely determined, as if there was something evil hidden in his sanctuary, something that made the room itself afraid. Then someday he would find a way to remove it. "Dobby," he said suddenly, struck by an idea. "Could you teach me a light spell? Something to push away darkness?" Dobby's expression softened at this request. "Harry Potter wants to learn the Lumos charm." "Is that what it's called?" Harry asked eagerly. "A spell to make light?" "A very useful spell, and one of the first that young wizards learn at Hogwarts." Dobby reached into his robes and produced a small, thin stick that Harry recognized as a wand. "This belonged to a young wizard who left it behind years ago. The room has kept it safe, and now it thinks Harry Potter might have need of it." Harry accepted the wand with reverent care. It was made of some pale wood that felt warm and alive in his hands, and the moment his fingers closed around it, he felt a surge of recognition, as if the wand had been waiting for him specifically. "The words are Lumos," Dobby explained. "But the words are less important than the intention. You must want light. Not just any light, but light that comes from inside you. Light that represents everything good and bright and hopeful about magic." Harry raised the wand, feeling the magic flowing through him like warm honey. He thought about everything good in his life: Dobby's kindness, the room's protection, the books and toys and comfortable bed, the safety and love he had never experienced before. He thought about the laughter that came so easily now, about the way Dobby's eyes lit up when Harry mastered something new, and about the hope he felt when he imagined his future at Hogwarts. "Lumos," he said clearly, and the tip of his wand burst into brilliant, warm light. The light was stronger than either of them had expected, not the gentle glow that most first-year students managed, but a radiant beacon that filled the entire room with warmth and comfort. The protective enchantments that had manifested in response to the dark memory seemed to pulse with approval, and Harry felt the room's consciousness settling into peaceful contentment around them. "Very good, Harry Potter," Dobby said softly, and Harry could hear the pride in his voice. "Very good indeed." Harry held the light for several minutes, marveling at the way it felt to consciously direct his magic for the first time. This wasn't accidental magic triggered by emotion or need. This was intentional, controlled, and completely his own. The sensation was intoxicating. When he finally allowed the light to fade, the room had returned to its usual cheerful state, though Harry noticed that some of the protective symbols remained visible in the corners, subtle reminders of the conversation they had just had. "Will you tell me more about the scary boy someday?" Harry asked, as they settled back into their usual evening routine. "When you are older," Dobby promised. "When you are strong enough to hear such stories without being harmed by them. For now, it is enough that you know there are dark things in the world, and that your light is strong enough to push them away." Harry nodded, satisfied with this answer. He tucked his new wand carefully under his pillow. Somehow he knew it belonged there, and allowed Dobby to read him a bedtime story about a young witch who used her magic to heal sick animals. But as he drifted off to sleep, Harry found himself thinking not about the story, but about the power he had felt when he cast his first real spell. The magic had felt familiar in a way that went beyond simple comfort. It had felt like coming home to something he had always possessed but never understood. And in the depths of the room, something dark and ancient stirred restlessly, aware now that it was no longer hidden from detection, and that the child sleeping peacefully above might someday possess the power to cast it out entirely. But that, Harry thought drowsily, was a problem for tomorrow's version of himself. Tonight, he was safe and warm and surrounded by love, and his own light was strong enough to keep any darkness at bay. Chapter 6. Dobby's Dilemma. 1 year of freedom had transformed Harry Potter into someone almost unrecognizable from the terrified child who had once cowered in a cupboard under the stairs. At 7 years old, he possessed a confidence and intelligence that would have been remarkable in any child, but which seemed almost supernatural in someone who had endured his early experiences. His magical abilities had grown exponentially, fed by emotional stability and careful instruction, until even Dobby sometimes found himself amazed by what the boy could accomplish with barely a thought. But power, Dobby was learning, came with its own complications. "Why can't I go outside?" Harry asked, for what felt like the 100th time that week, looking up from the advanced transfiguration text he had been reading with disturbing ease. The book was meant for third-year students at Hogwarts, but Harry had worked through the first and second-year materials months ago and showed no signs of slowing down. It was a question that had grown more frequent and more pointed as Harry's understanding of his situation had matured. Where once he had been content to accept Dobby's explanations about safety and bad wizards, his increasingly sharp mind had begun to identify the logical inconsistencies in his confinement. "Harry Potter knows why," Dobby said carefully, not looking up from the sock he was darning. These conversations had become a minefield, requiring him to balance honesty with protection, or truth with comfort. There are still dangerous people in the world who would hurt Harry Potter if they knew where he was. "But I'm stronger now," Harry pointed out with the irrefutable logic of childhood. "You've taught me spells, and I can do magic without even trying. I made that bird yesterday, remember? The one that flew around the room and sang songs?" Dobby did remember. Harry had conjured a fully functional magical canary out of nothing more than focused intention and a handful of yellow flower petals the room had provided. It was the kind of magic that would have impressed a 7th-year student, performed by a 7-year-old who treated it as casually as most children treated drawing pictures. "Magic is not always enough to keep someone safe," Dobby said, though the words felt increasingly hollow even to his own ears. "Or sometimes hiding is the wisest choice." Harry was quiet for a long moment, but Dobby could practically hear the gears turning in his head. The boy had grown too perceptive, too clever to be satisfied with simple platitudes. "Dobby," Harry said finally, his voice small and careful in a way that made Dobby's chest tighten with worry. "Am I a prisoner?" The question hit like a physical blow. Dobby's hands stilled on his mending, and he forced himself to meet Harry's eyes, those startlingly green eyes that had grown so bright and expressive over their year together. Why would Harry Potter think such a thing? "Because prisoners are people who have to stay in one place, even when they don't want to," Harry said with devastating accuracy. "And I want to see other places. I want to meet other people. And I want to go to the library you've told me about, and the Great Hall, and maybe just walk on the grass outside without having to watch through a window." The room, as if responding to Harry's emotional state, had begun manifesting things that spoke to his growing isolation. Small windows had appeared in the walls, offering views of the Hogwarts grounds that Harry studied with desperate longing. Portraits had materialized, not the talking paintings that adorned the rest of the castle, but simple pictures of groups of children laughing and playing together. Most heartbreaking of all, Harry had begun creating elaborate imaginary friends, talking to empty spaces as if they were occupied by companions who understood his jokes and shared his interests. "Harry Potter is not a prisoner," Dobby said firmly. "Harry Potter is protected. There is a difference," Is there? Harry asked, and the quiet sadness in his voice made Dobby want to weep. Because I don't feel protected, Dobby. I feel lonely. Very, very lonely. 20 miles away, in the opulent drawing room of Malfoy Manor, Narcissa Malfoy was voicing suspicions that had been growing in her mind for months. There's something different about Dobby, she said, without preamble, looking up from the book of genealogy she had been studying. Have you noticed? Lucius Malfoy, who had been reviewing correspondence from his various business interests, paused with his quill halfway to the inkwell. Different how? Happier. Narcissa's tone made it clear that she found this development deeply suspicious. House elves are not supposed to be happy, Lucius. They're supposed to be dutiful and invisible and quietly miserable. But lately, Dobby positively glows with contentment. He hums while he works. He smiles at nothing. Yesterday I caught him actually skipping down the corridor. Lucius set down his quill and gave his wife his full attention. Narcissa's observations about household matters were rarely wrong, and her instincts for detecting deception were particularly acute. Now that you mention it, he said slowly, I have noticed that he seems rather chipper lately, and he's been absent more frequently, claiming extra duties, additional cleaning projects. Always some excuse for why he's not immediately available when summoned. Exactly. Narcissa closed her book with a sharp snap. House elves don't develop hobbies, Lucius. But they don't go off on mysterious errands that fill them with joy. They certainly don't start humming cheerful little songs while they polish the silver. The implications hung between them, unspoken but understood. A happy house elf was either a broken house elf or a house elf with secrets, and secrets, in the Malfoy household, were not tolerated. Perhaps it's time we paid closer attention to our dear Dobby's activities, Lucius said thoughtfully. House elves who develop independent interests have a tendency to become problematic. Narcissa nodded, her pale eyes cold with calculation. I'll begin monitoring his movements more carefully. If he's up to something, we'll discover what it is soon enough. Neither of them noticed the slight tremor in the air near the doorway, for where a house elf, who had been about to announce that dinner was ready, had frozen in horror at what he had overheard. Dobby's hands were shaking as he returned to the room of requirement that evening, the Malfoys' words echoing in his mind like a death sentence. They were suspicious. They were watching. And if they discovered what he had been doing, the consequences didn't bear thinking about. Dobby! Harry's voice was bright with welcome as the house elf materialized in their sanctuary. I've been working on that levitation charm you showed me, and I think I finally... Dobby, what's wrong? Harry's excitement died immediately as he took in Dobby's obvious distress. The boy's emotional intelligence had grown as sharp as his magical abilities, and he could read Dobby's moods with disturbing accuracy. Nothing is wrong, Dobby lied, though he knew Harry wouldn't believe it. Dobby is simply tired from a long day of work. Harry studied him for a moment, then patted the bed beside him in the universal gesture of offering comfort. Come sit with me. Tell me what happened. The simple kindness nearly broke Dobby's resolve entirely. Here was this child, this precious, brilliant, powerful child, offering comfort to the creature who had been lying to him for a year about the true nature of his circumstances. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. Dobby settled onto the bed, and Harry immediately curled up against his side with the unconscious trust of someone who had never doubted his guardian's love. It was a gesture that would have seemed impossible during those early days when Harry flinched away from any physical contact. My masters are becoming suspicious of my behavior, Dobby said finally, deciding that some version of the truth might be safer than continued deception. Suspicious how? They have noticed that Dobby seems happier lately. House elves are not supposed to be happy, Harry Potter. We are supposed to be dutiful and invisible and quietly miserable. But spending time with you has made Dobby happier than he has ever been, and that happiness is difficult to hide. Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention he brought to all of Dobby's explanations about the complexities of the magical world. "What will happen if they find out about me?" he asked eventually. The question Dobby had been dreading, the one he had no good answer for. "Dobby does not know," he admitted. "But it would not be safe for either of us." "So I really am a prisoner," Harry said softly. "I'm not just hiding from bad people out there. I'm hiding from your masters, too. I'm trapped between people who want to hurt me and people who own you, and there's nowhere I can go that's truly safe." The accuracy of this assessment was devastating. Dobby had tried so hard to frame Harry's situation in positive terms to make the boy feel protected rather than confined. But Harry's intelligence had outgrown such gentle deceptions. "Harry Potter is safe here," Dobby said desperately. "In this room, with Dobby to care for him, he is completely safe." "But what kind of life is that?" Harry asked, pulling away to look directly into Dobby's eyes. "What's the point of being safe if I'm alone? What's the point of learning magic if I never get to use it with other people? What's the point of reading about friendship and adventure and all these wonderful things if I never get to experience them myself?" Each question landed like a blow. Dobby had been so focused on keeping Harry physically safe that he had failed to consider the psychological cost of total isolation. The boy was 7 years old, intellectually gifted, and magically powerful, but he was still a child. Children needed companionship, stimulation, the chance to test themselves against their peers and learn through social interaction. By keeping Harry hidden, Dobby realized with growing horror he might be damaging him in entirely new ways. "I talk to the portraits sometimes," Harry continued, his voice growing smaller and more vulnerable. "But I pretend they can hear me and talk back. I make up conversations with imaginary friends and act out both parts. Is that normal, Dobby? Do normal children do that?" "Harry Potter is not a normal child," Dobby said gently, though the words felt like admitting defeat. "I know that," Harry said with a bitter wisdom that sounded wrong coming from someone so young. "I'm the famous boy who lived, aren't I? The one whose parents died to save him. The one who defeated a terrible wizard when he was just a baby. I've figured out most of it by now, even though you've tried to protect me from the details." Dobby's heart sank. He had hoped to shield Harry from the full weight of his fame and responsibility for a few more years at least. "But famous or not, I'm still a person," Harry continued. "I still need friends and teachers and challenges and experiences. I still need to be around other people, even if it's dangerous. Because this—" He gestured around the beautiful room that had been their sanctuary for so long. "This isn't living, Dobby. This is just existing." The truth of it was undeniable. Harry was withering in isolation, no matter how gilded his cage might be. His intelligence was stagnating without proper challenge, his social skills were atrophying without practice, and his emotional development was being stunted by the absence of peer relationships. Dobby had saved Harry from physical abuse, only to subject him to a subtler but equally damaging form of neglect. "What does Harry Potter want Dobby to do?" he asked quietly. Harry was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the grounds where students would soon return for the new term. When he spoke, his voice carried a determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "I want to go to school," he said simply. "I want to sit in classes with other children and raise my hand and answer questions and make friends and maybe even enemies. I want to eat in the Great Hall and sleep in a dormitory and get in trouble for talking after lights out. I want to be a normal student at a magical school, even if it means people know who I am." "It would be very dangerous," Dobby said weakly. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Harry replied, and Dobby recognized his own words from one of their many philosophical conversations coming back to haunt him. "You taught me that, remember? You said that the greatest magic requires the greatest courage." Dobby closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his impossible situation pressing down on him like stones. Harry deserved a normal childhood, or as close to one as his circumstances would allow. He deserved friends and teachers, and the chance to grow into the remarkable person he was clearly destined to become. But giving him those things would mean risking discovery by the Malfoys, potential danger from those who might wish Harry harm, and almost certain separation from the child who had become the light of Dobby's existence. "Dobby needs time to think," he said finally. "This is not a decision to be made quickly or without careful consideration." Harry nodded, though Dobby could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. But Dobby?" He reached out and took the house elf's hand in his own. "I need you to really think about it, because I can't keep living like this much longer. I'm going crazy from loneliness, and even magic isn't enough to make up for having no one my own age to talk to." That night, as Harry slept peacefully in his magical sanctuary, Dobby sat by the window and stared out at the castle that could offer the boy everything he needed: education, companionship, purpose, and a chance at a real life. The question that haunted him was whether he loved Harry enough to let him go, and whether he could find the courage to make a choice that might destroy them both. Outside, the first letters from Hogwarts were being prepared for delivery to children who would soon begin their magical education. In less than a month, the castle would be filled with laughter and learning and all the normal chaos of young people discovering their potential. Harry Potter deserved to be among them, Dobby realized, no matter what the cost might be to himself. Chapter 7. The Student's Glimpse. 2 years of hidden life had shaped Harry Potter into something unprecedented in the wizarding world, a child who possessed the magical knowledge of a fourth-year student, the intellectual curiosity of a scholar, and the desperate loneliness of someone who had never had a real conversation with another person his own age. At 8 years old, Harry had read through advanced texts on transfiguration, charms, and even some basic defense against the dark arts. He could perform magic that would have impressed professors, conjure complex illusions for his own entertainment, and engage in philosophical discussions about the nature of magic that would have challenged graduate students. But he had never played a game of exploding snap with a friend, never shared a joke during a boring lesson, never experienced the simple joy of being part of a group. The isolation was eating at him from the inside out. "I dreamed about having friends again last night," Harry said during their morning routine, his voice carefully neutral as he spread jam on his toast. These dreams had become more frequent lately, vivid scenarios where he sat in classes surrounded by other children, where he had a best friend who understood his jokes and shared his interests. Dobby's ears flattened slightly at the comment, that these conversations had become a daily torment for both of them. Harry's growing desperation for human contact, warring against Dobby's terror of discovery by the Malfoys, who had begun asking increasingly pointed questions about his whereabouts. "What kind of dreams?" Dobby asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I was in the Great Hall, but not watching from the window like I usually do. I was sitting at one of the tables, and there were other kids around me. A girl with bushy brown hair who kept asking questions about everything, and a boy with red hair who made me laugh until my sides hurt." Harry's eyes had that distant, wistful quality that had become painfully familiar. "We were all working on homework together, and when I got stuck on something, they helped me figure it out. And when they didn't understand something, I explained it to them." The specificity of the dream worried Dobby more than he cared to admit. Harry's magical gifts included a touch of natural legilimency, the ability to sense thoughts and emotions, and sometimes his dreams picked up on the experiences of the students below. It was possible that the children he described actually existed, actual Hogwarts students whose minds he had unconsciously touched during their meals in the Great Hall. "Dreams can be wonderful places to visit," Dobby said carefully, "but they can also make us sad when we wake up." "I know." Harry's voice was small, "but they're the only place I get to have friends." The admission hung between them like a physical weight. Dobby had tried to be everything to Harry: teacher, caregiver, friend, family, but he was painfully aware of his limitations. He could not provide the experience of peer interaction, the challenge of competing with intellectual equals, or the complex social dynamics that shaped normal childhood development. Harry was brilliant, magical, and utterly alone. 3 floors below, in the Ravenclaw common room, fifth-year prefect Eleanor Whitmore was experiencing her own form of frustration. The approaching OWL exams had turned the common room into a battlefield of competing study groups, chattering first years, and the occasional bout of stress-induced magical accidents that made concentration impossible. "I need somewhere quiet," she muttered to herself, gathering her ancient runes textbook and notes into an untidy pile. The library was equally chaotic this time of year, and her dormitory was currently occupied by her roommates, practicing transfiguration with increasingly dramatic results. Eleanor had heard rumors, of course, about a room somewhere in the castle that could provide whatever a student needed. Most people dismissed it as wishful thinking, but Eleanor had been at Hogwarts long enough to know that seemingly impossible things had a way of turning out to be perfectly real. The 7th floor corridor was empty when she arrived, which was not unusual for a Tuesday afternoon when most students were either in classes or studying in more conventional locations. Eleanor walked slowly past the stretch of wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, trying to remember the specific instructions she had heard whispered in the common room. Walk past 3 times, concentrating on what you need. "I need a quiet place to study," she said aloud on her first pass, feeling somewhat foolish. "Somewhere peaceful, without distractions, where I can focus on ancient runes without interruption." On her second pass, she concentrated harder, visualizing the ideal study environment: comfortable chairs, good lighting, perhaps some reference books to supplement her own materials. On her third pass, the wall began to shimmer. Eleanor stopped walking, her heart racing with excitement and disbelief. The solid stone was definitely changing, flowing like water until it formed an elegant doorway that seemed to invite her inside. She pushed open the door and stepped into wonder. The room beyond was perfect, everything she had imagined and more. Its comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace that crackled with warming flames, shelves lined with exactly the reference books she needed, and a writing desk positioned to catch the best light from windows that showed a peaceful view of the castle grounds. But something was wrong. Eleanor had expected to find an empty room, a blank canvas shaped by her own needs and desires. Instead, she found traces of long habitation that spoke of someone else's presence. A child's drawing lay forgotten on one of the side tables, a surprisingly skillful illustration of a phoenix in flight, signed with a careful HP in the corner. Child-sized furniture flickered in and out of existence around the edges of her vision, as if the room were struggling to decide between her needs and the requirements of its previous occupant. She picked up the drawing, studying it with growing curiosity. The artwork was remarkably sophisticated for a child's work, showing both natural talent and advanced instruction. The phoenix had been rendered with careful attention to anatomical detail and shading techniques that most students didn't learn until their later years at Hogwarts. "Hello," she called softly, half expecting a response. "Is someone else here?" Silence answered her, but it was not the empty silence of an unoccupied space. It was the held-breath quiet of someone hiding, someone who desperately did not want to be found. Eleanor was a Ravenclaw, which meant her curiosity was as sharp as her intelligence. She began examining the room more carefully, noting the small inconsistencies that suggested dual purpose. A bookshelf that flickered between her advanced runes texts and what looked like children's fairy tales. A desk that occasionally showed signs of long use, ink stains, worn patches in the wood, the kind of familiar damage that came from daily occupation over months or years. Most telling of all was a small area near the fireplace, where the floorboards showed the distinctive wear pattern of someone who spent long hours sitting in that exact spot. Someone small enough that their feet wouldn't have reached the floor. A child. Someone had been living in this room, or at least spending considerable time here. A child who could draw phoenixes with professional skill and sign their work with the initials HP. Eleanor's mind began racing through possibilities. There were no students at Hogwarts with those initials that she could remember, or certainly none young enough to account for the child-sized furniture. And what student would have been living secretly in a hidden room? Unless... The thought that occurred to her was so impossible, so completely unthinkable, that she dismissed it immediately. But as she continued to examine the evidence around her, the impossible began to seem merely improbable, and the improbable began to edge toward possible. H.P. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, who had vanished from his relative's home 2 years ago and never been found despite the most intensive search in wizarding history. But that was ridiculous. Harry Potter was 8 years old, far too young to be at Hogwarts, and if he had somehow been hiding in the castle all this time, surely someone would have noticed. The teachers, the house elves, of the portraits, someone would have seen something. Eleanor tucked the drawing into her robes and settled down to study, but her concentration was thoroughly broken. Every few minutes, she found herself looking around the room, searching for more evidence of its mysterious previous occupant. She found it in the form of a small sock that materialized briefly under one of the chairs before vanishing again, as if the room had accidentally summoned it from some hidden storage space. Child-sized, well-made, and bearing the distinctive weave of house elf magic, Eleanor Whitmore was an intelligent girl who had been raised on stories of the boy who lived. She knew that Harry Potter had been placed with Muggle relatives after his parents' death, knew that he had disappeared without a trace during the summer 2 years ago. She also knew that disappearances of that magnitude didn't happen without help, magical help from someone who understood how to hide a person from even Dumbledore's searching spells. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture that made her feel slightly sick with the implications. If Harry Potter was somehow hidden in Hogwarts, if he had been here all along while the wizarding world tore itself apart looking for him, then someone with extraordinary magical skill had been caring for him in secret. Someone like a house elf. Eleanor left the room eventually, her studying forgotten in favor of a mystery that made her hands shake with nervous excitement. But as she walked back toward Ravenclaw Tower, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to tell her friends what she had found. 2 floors above, Harry Potter was experiencing his own moment of dangerous discovery. The castle had been nearly empty for the past week, a holiday weekend that had sent most students home to visit their families. It was during these quiet periods that Harry's isolation became most unbearable, when the silence of his hidden room felt less like sanctuary and more like a tomb. Against Dobby's increasingly frantic warnings, Harry had begun venturing out. It had started small, quick trips to the bathroom down the hall during the dead of night, brief explorations of the corridor outside his room. But as his confidence grew and his desperation for change intensified, his expeditions had become bolder and more extensive. Tonight, he had made it all the way to the library. The vast space took his breath away. Harry had read about the Hogwarts library in his textbooks, had heard Dobby describe its wonders during their evening conversations, but seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. Thousands upon thousands of books stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines glowing softly in the magical light that illuminated the space. Harry moved through the aisles like a pilgrim in a temple, running his fingers along the spines of volumes he had only dreamed of reading. Advanced texts on magic theory, historical accounts of wizarding society, biographies of famous witches and wizards, knowledge beyond his wildest imagination, all within reach. He was so absorbed in his exploration that he almost didn't hear the footsteps. Argus Filch moved through the library with the careful steps of someone conducting a routine patrol, his lamp casting dancing shadows between the shelves. Harry's heart stopped as he realized his situation. Trapped in the open with nowhere to hide, about to be discovered by the one person in the castle whose job it was to catch students out of bounds. Panic flooded through him, triggering the kind of accidental magic that had been growing stronger and more unpredictable as his frustration mounted. The shadows around him deepened and thickened, bending light away from his small form until he was effectively invisible to normal sight. Books rearranged themselves on nearby shelves to create the illusion that no one had been browsing in that section. Filch passed within 3 feet of where Harry stood, frozen in terror and wrapped in shadows that clung to him like living darkness. The caretaker paused, his narrow eyes scanning the area with the instincts of someone who had spent decades catching sneaking students. "Something's not right," Filch muttered to himself, raising his lamp higher. "Feels like someone's been poking around where they shouldn't be." Harry held his breath until his lungs burned, maintaining his magical concealment through sheer force of will. The shadows felt almost solid around him, responding to his desperate need to remain hidden with an intensity that frightened him even as it protected him. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Filch continued his patrol, grumbling to himself about the impossibility of keeping track of every student in a castle the size of Hogwarts. Harry remained hidden until the sound of footsteps had faded completely, then let his concealment drop with a gasp of exhaustion. The effort of maintaining such powerful magic had drained him more than he expected, leaving him shaky and disoriented. He made his way back to the room of requirement as quickly and quietly as possible, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. His magic was growing stronger, more responsive to his emotional state, but also more unpredictable. The shadows that had hidden him had felt almost alive, eager to help him remain concealed. It was the kind of magic that would have impressed a 7th-year student, performed instinctively by an 8-year-old who had never had formal instruction in advanced concealment charms. When Dobby found him 20 minutes later, Harry was huddled on his bed, still trembling from the encounter. "Harry Potter left the room," Dobby said. And it wasn't a question. The house elf's magical senses could detect the residual traces of Harry's magic throughout the castle, could read the story of his unauthorized expedition in the way his magical signature had interacted with the ancient stones. "I'm sorry," Harry said quickly. "I know you told me not to. But I was so lonely, and the castle was so quiet, and I just wanted to see the library for myself." Dobby sank into his chair, looking older and more tired than Harry had ever seen him. The stress of maintaining their secret was taking an increasing toll on the house elf, who now spent most of his time at the manor, deflecting the Malfoys' suspicions and cleaning up the magical traces that Harry left during his increasingly frequent outbursts. "Harry Potter was nearly discovered," Dobby said quietly. "Dobby can sense the echoes of concealment magic throughout the library. Very powerful concealment magic, the kind that leaves traces." "I couldn't help it," Harry said defensively. "Filch was right there, and I was scared, and the magic just happened." "Dobby knows." The house elf's voice was infinitely sad. "Dobby knows that Harry Potter cannot control magic that strong when he is frightened. But other people will notice those traces. They will ask questions about who could perform such advanced magic, and some of those questions will lead them toward answers that put both of us in terrible danger." Harry looked down at his hands, guilt warring with frustration in his chest. He understood the danger intellectually, but emotionally he felt like he was suffocating. Or the room that had once felt like sanctuary now felt like a prison, and no amount of magical books or conjured toys could make up for the basic human need for companionship and community. "How much longer?" he asked quietly. "How much longer before I can have a normal life?" Dobby was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace with eyes that held the weight of impossible decisions. "Dobby does not know," he admitted finally. "The Malfoys are asking more questions. Other students are beginning to notice strange things in the castle. Harry Potter's magic is growing stronger and harder to hide. All of these things are coming together in ways that frighten Dobby very much." "Are we going to have to leave?" Harry asked, though the thought of abandoning the only real home he had ever known made his chest tight with panic. "Perhaps," Dobby said softly. "Or perhaps it is time for Dobby to consider other options. Dangerous options that Dobby has been too frightened to think about properly." Harry didn't ask what those options might be. He was 8 years old, brilliant and magically gifted, but still a child who trusted the adult figure in his life to make the decisions that would keep him safe. But as he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling that showed him a perfect view of stars he was not allowed to visit, Harry Potter began to understand that their time in the Room of Requirement was running out. Change was coming, whether they wanted it or not. And for the first time since his rescue, Harry found himself wondering if change might not be such a terrible thing after all. In the darkness, he practicing moving shadows around his bed, marveling at the way they responded to his will like eager pets. Whatever happened next, he would be ready for it. He hoped. Chapter 8. Magical Maturation. 3 years of hidden magical education had created something unprecedented in the wizarding world. A 9-year-old boy whose raw magical power rivaled that of adult wizards, whose theoretical knowledge exceeded many university students, and whose emotional control had been stretched to the breaking point by years of enforced isolation. Harry Potter sat in the center of his sanctuary, surrounded by a constellation of objects that hung suspended in mid-air without any conscious direction from him. Books, quills, teacups, and various conjured butterflies orbited around him in complex patterns, responding to the magical field that had begun emanating from him constantly rather than just during active spell casting. The change had been gradual at first, small objects moving when he was deep in thought, candles lighting themselves when he entered a room, his bath water always being exactly the right temperature without him having to adjust it. But over the past few months, his unconscious magic had grown so powerful that the Room of Requirement was struggling to contain it. "I'm tired of being alone," Harry said quietly, and the words carried enough emotional weight that every piece of glass in the room resonated like a struck bell. "I'm tired of talking to books and imaginary friends and portraits that don't answer back. I'm tired of watching other children through windows and wondering what it would feel like to have someone my own age care about me." The magical pressure in the room built with each word, and Dobby, who had been attempting to mend a tear in one of Harry's outgrown robes, found himself pressed back into his chair by the sheer force of the boy's unconscious power. "Harry Potter must try to stay calm," Dobby said urgently, recognizing the signs of an approaching magical outburst. Over the past year, these episodes had become more frequent and more dangerous, requiring increasingly creative explanations to account for the collateral damage they caused throughout the castle. "I don't want to be calm," Harry's voice cracked with the strain of 3 years' worth of suppressed longing and frustration. "I want to be angry. I want to be sad. I want to feel things without having to worry about whether my emotions are going to bring the whole castle down around us." The last word emerged as something between a shout and a sob, and the magical energy that had been building around Harry exploded outward like a shockwave. The room's walls buckled and reformed themselves 3 times in the span of seconds, cycling through different configurations as Harry's magic overwhelmed its ability to maintain a stable environment. The windows showed rapid flashes of different views: the lake, the forest, the grounds, the great hall, as if the room were frantically searching for something that might calm its inhabitant. But the most catastrophic effect was what happened beyond their sanctuary. Harry's emotional outburst had been so powerful, so charged with raw magical force, or that it punched straight through the room's concealment wards like a stone through tissue paper. Magical resonance flooded through the castle's ancient stones, setting off sympathetic responses in every enchanted object and awakening magical creature within a quarter-mile radius. In the great hall, the house elves preparing for the upcoming term felt the wave of power wash over them and stopped their work to stare at each other with wide, frightened eyes. Something that strong should not have been possible from within the castle. not without every teacher and monitoring charm in Hogwarts detecting it immediately. In the dungeons, the portraits of former Hogwarts headmasters began reporting strange, vivid dreams about a child with green eyes who called out to them from somewhere they couldn't identify. The suits of armor on the 3rd floor began marching in formation without any human command, responding to magical impulses that felt like orders, but came from no identifiable source. And in the headmaster's office, Albus Dumbledore looked up from his correspondence with an expression of stunned bewilderment as every magical instrument in the room began chiming, spinning, and emitting puffs of colored smoke in apparent harmony. "Fawkes," Dumbledore said quietly, addressing the phoenix who sat on his perch with ruffled feathers and alert eyes. "Do you feel that?" The phoenix trilled a low, complex melody that somehow managed to convey both recognition and deep concern. Dumbledore rose from his desk and moved to the tall windows that looked out over the castle grounds. Whatever had just happened, it had originated from within Hogwarts itself, a burst of magical power so pure and strong that it had briefly overwhelmed the ancient wards that protected the school. The signature was familiar in a way that made his chest tight with impossible hope. But that was surely wishful thinking. The magical resonance reminded him of James Potter's raw power, filtered through Lily's precise control and amplified by something he couldn't identify. But James and Lily were dead, had been dead for 8 years. And their son had been missing for 3 years, vanished without a trace despite the most intensive search in wizarding history. "It's not possible," Dumbledore murmured to himself. But his hands were already reaching for his wand, and the detection spells that might tell him something useful about the source of that devastating magical pulse. In the room of requirement, Harry was staring at the destruction around him with wide, horrified eyes. Every piece of furniture had been reduced to splinters. The books that had been his constant companions were scattered across the floor like broken birds. Even the walls showed stress fractures, where his magic had tested the limits of what the room could repair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words carried enough genuine remorse that the room immediately began pulling itself back together, eager to forgive its beloved inhabitant. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "Harry Potter must not apologize," Dobby said firmly, though his voice shook with the aftershocks of what he had just witnessed. Harry Potter's magic is growing stronger than Dobby expected. Much stronger. This is not Harry Potter's fault. But privately, Dobby was terrified. The magical outburst had been visible to anyone with the slightest sensitivity to magical energy. There would be investigations, questions, searches, and eventually those searches would lead back to the 7th floor and the room that wasn't supposed to exist. More importantly, Harry's magic was developing in ways that went far beyond normal childhood advancement. The power the boy had just displayed was closer to what Dobby might expect from a 7th-year student, someone with 6 years of formal training and full magical maturation. Harry Potter, at 9 years old, was already approaching the magical capacity of an adult wizard. "Dobby," Harry said quietly, his voice small and ashamed. "What's happening to me? Why is my magic so much?" It was a question Dobby had been dreading, because he didn't have a good answer. Harry's magical development had accelerated far beyond anything he had read about in the child development texts he had borrowed from the library. The boy's power seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger with each passing month, as if responding to some internal pressure that demanded constant expansion. "Harry Potter is very special," Dobby said finally. "His magic is stronger than most wizards, because he survived something that should have killed him. That experience changed him in ways that even Dobby does not fully understand." It was a careful half-truth. That Dobby suspected that Harry's isolation, paradoxically, was contributing to his magical growth. Without the natural outlets that normal social interaction provided, without the ability to form the emotional bonds that helped young wizards regulate their power, all of Harry's magical energy was turning inward, building pressure like steam in a sealed container. I need better lessons, Harry said suddenly, his voice carrying a determination that Dobby found both admirable and alarming. If my magic is going to keep getting stronger, I need to learn how to control it properly. The basic spells you've been teaching me aren't enough anymore. Dobby knew Harry was right, but the implications made his large ears flatten against his skull with anxiety. Advanced magical education would require advanced textbooks, complex spell work, and the kind of detailed instruction that was normally provided by qualified professors, all of which would leave traces. Magical signatures, borrowed books, evidence of spellcasting that was far too sophisticated for a 9-year-old child to have learned on his own. Dobby could borrow some advanced textbooks from the library, he said hesitantly. 4th year, 5th year materials. But Harry Potter would have to be very careful about practicing advanced magic. Very, very careful. Harry's face lit up with the first genuine smile Dobby had seen from him in weeks. Really? You'd do that for me? Dobby would do anything for Harry Potter, the house elf said simply, and meant every word. Over the following weeks, Dobby began what amounted to a systematic theft of educational materials, as advanced texts on transfiguration theory, complex charms work, detailed guides to magical creatures and their properties. He was careful to take only books that wouldn't be missed immediately, rotating his selections to avoid creating obvious gaps on the library shelves. Harry absorbed the new material with a hunger that both impressed and worried Dobby. The boy would spend 12 hours at a stretch reading through advanced magical theory, taking notes with the methodical precision of a graduate student and asking questions that demonstrated an understanding of fundamental magical principles that most adult wizards never achieved. More disturbing was how quickly Harry mastered practical application. Spells that should have required months of practice, Harry could perform after a single attempt. Transfigurations that challenged 6th-year students came as naturally to him as breathing. His magical control, when he focused on it, was so precise that he could levitate individual dust motes or change the color of a single thread in a piece of fabric. This shouldn't be possible, Dobby muttered to himself as he watched Harry successfully perform a conjuration charm that was typically taught in 7th year. The boy had read about the spell exactly once, 3 days ago, and was now manifesting complex objects from pure magical energy, as if he had been doing it all his life. What shouldn't be possible? Harry asked, looking up from the perfectly detailed crystal butterfly he had just conjured from nothing. Nothing, Harry Potter. Dobby is simply amazed by how quickly you learn. But amazement was only part of what Dobby felt. A growing dread made up the rest. Harry Potter was not developing like a normal magical child. His power and knowledge were advancing at a rate that suggested something far beyond natural talent or good instruction. It was as if the magic itself was pushing him toward some predetermined level of capability, rushing his development in ways that might have dangerous consequences. The confirmation of Dobby's worst fears came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the room had manifested a small garden area in response to Harry's expressed desire to see something green and growing. Harry was sitting beside a fountain that sparkled with magically clean water, reading through a text on magical creature communication, when a small grass snake emerged from the undergrowth. It was a harmless creature, probably drawn by the warmth of the magical environment, but its appearance made Harry look up from his book with interest. "Hello there," Harry said absently, his attention still partially focused on the complex diagrams in his textbook. "You're very pretty. Are you real, or did the room create you?" The snake raised its head and looked directly at Harry with bright, intelligent eyes. "I am real, young speaker. The magic here called to me. You smell of old power, old pain. Who are you?" Harry blinked, then looked around the garden as if expecting to see someone else who might have spoken. When he saw no one, he looked back at the snake with growing confusion. Did you just talk to me?" "You heard me," the snake said, and this time Harry could see its mouth moving in rhythm with the words he was hearing. "You have the gift, young one. the ability to speak with the serpent kind. But you smell wrong for one who bears this gift. You smell of light, not shadow." Harry stared at the snake for a long moment, his mind racing to process what was happening. Then, almost without conscious thought, he responded, "I don't understand. What gift? What do you mean I smell wrong?" The words that came out of his mouth were not English. They were something else entirely. A hissing, sibilant language that seemed to emerge from some deep part of his mind that he hadn't known existed. Parseltongue. He was speaking Parseltongue. Harry dropped his book and scrambled backward, his heart racing with sudden terror. He had read about Parseltongue in one of the more advanced texts Dobby had borrowed. The ability to communicate with snakes, what a rare gift associated with dark wizards and, most famously, with the Dark Lord who had killed his parents. "Why do you flee, young speaker? Have I frightened you?" But Harry was no longer listening. He was backing toward the door of the garden area, his breathing rapid and panicked, while the snake watched him with what might have been sympathy. When Dobby found him 10 minutes later, Harry was huddled in his bed with the covers pulled over his head, shaking like a leaf in a storm. "Harry Potter, what is wrong?" Dobby asked, immediately sensing the distress radiating from the boy in waves. "I can talk to snakes," Harry said in a muffled voice. "There was a snake in the garden, and I could understand what it was saying, and I talked back to it in snake language. Dobby, what does that mean? What's wrong with me?" The question hit Dobby like a physical blow. Of all the developments he had feared, this was perhaps the worst. Parseltongue was not a gift that manifested randomly or through advanced study. It was an inherited ability, passed down through bloodlines, and in the modern wizarding world it was associated almost exclusively with dark wizards and their descendants. More specifically, it was associated with Tom Riddle and the family line he had claimed through conquest and murder. "Where did this ability come from?" Harry continued, his voice growing smaller and more frightened. "The snake said I smelled wrong for someone with this gift, said I smelled of light instead of shadow. But if this is a dark ability, and I have it, does that mean there's something dark inside me?" Dobby's mind raced through possibilities, searching for an explanation that would comfort Harry without revealing truths the boy was far too young to understand. The connection between Harry and the Dark Lord, the piece of Voldemort's soul that had attached itself to the boy on the night his parents died, was not something a 9-year-old could be expected to process without serious psychological damage. "Sometimes," Dobby said carefully, "magical abilities can be gained through magical accidents. When Harry Potter survived what should have killed him, many things about his magic changed. Perhaps this is one of those changes." "But it's a dark gift," Harry said, emerging from his blankets with tear-stained cheeks. "Everyone knows that only dark wizards can talk to snakes." "Harry Potter is not a dark wizard," Dobby said firmly. "Harry Potter is the kindest, or most gentle person Dobby has ever known. A magical ability does not determine whether someone is good or evil. It is what they choose to do with that ability that matters." It was true, as far as it went, but Dobby could not shake the feeling that Harry's development was accelerating towards something that none of them were prepared to handle. The boy's magical power was approaching dangerous levels. His abilities were manifesting in ways that connected him to the darkest chapters of wizarding history, and the concealment that had protected them for 3 years was becoming increasingly fragile. Change was coming, whether they wanted it or not, and Dobby was no longer sure that change would be something they could survive. That night, as Harry slept fitfully in his bed, Dobby sat by the window and stared out at the castle that had been their sanctuary for so long. In the distance, he could see lights burning in the headmaster's office, where Albus Dumbledore was undoubtedly still investigating the magical disturbance that had shaken Hogwarts to its foundations. Time was running out. For all of them. Chapter 9. The Portrait's Tale. 4 years of hidden life had created a paradox in the form of Harry Potter, a 10-year-old boy who could discuss magical theory with the sophistication of a graduate student, perform spells that challenged seventh-year students, and debate the ethical implications of various magical practices with startling insight, yet who had never experienced the simple joy of sharing a joke with a friend his own age, or receiving a hug from someone who loved him purely for who he was, rather than what he represented. Harry sat in his favourite reading chair, surrounded by the advanced texts that had become both his greatest pleasure and his most painful reminder of what he was missing. The room had grown increasingly elaborate in its attempts to provide companionship, manifesting everything from talking chess sets to animated tapestries that told stories, but nothing could fill the aching void where human connection should have been. "I wonder what she was really like," Harry murmured, staring at a passage in a history book about the final years of the war against Voldemort. The text mentioned his mother only briefly. Lily Evans Potter, brilliant witch, member of the Order of the Phoenix, died protecting her son. Dry facts that told him nothing about who she had been as a person. The room, but always sensitive to Harry's emotional state, began to shift around him. The walls grew warmer in tone, taking on the golden hues of afternoon sunlight. The lighting became softer, more intimate, and in the corner where there had been an empty wall only moments before, an ornate frame began to materialize. Harry looked up from his book, curious about this new manifestation. The room had provided portraits before, but they were always generic, pleasant landscapes or still lifes that added beauty but no real comfort. This frame was different, clearly meant to hold something specific and important. As he watched, colors began to bloom within the frame, like watercolors spreading across wet paper. First came the background, what looked like the Gryffindor common room, recognizable from the tapestries and furniture he had seen in his history books. Then came the figure at the center, a young woman with brilliant green eyes and dark red hair that caught the light like burnished copper. She was beautiful, but it was not the cold perfection of a painted ideal. Her beauty was warm and alive, captured in the moment of a genuine laugh, her eyes bright with intelligence and kindness. She wore Hogwarts robes with a headgirl badge pinned to the chest, and something about her posture suggested confidence tempered by compassion. Harry's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. Those eyes, his eyes, the eyes he saw every morning in the mirror, stared back at him from the face of someone who could only be his mother. "Lily Potter," he whispered, and the sound of her name seemed to awaken something in the portrait. The painted figure turned toward him, and Harry watched in wonder as her expression shifted from the frozen moment of laughter to curiosity, then to stunned recognition. "Oh my goodness," she said, and her voice was everything Harry had dreamed it might be, warm and musical, with the slight breathlessness of someone who had just received an impossible surprise. "Oh my goodness, you're Harry." "My Harry." Harry dropped his book, his hands shaking as he stared at the portrait. "You can see me? You can talk to me? I can see you, sweetheart." Tears were gathering in Lily's painted eyes, and Harry felt his own vision blur in response. "You're so big, so grown up. How old are you now?" 10, Harry managed, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm 10 years old. And I've wanted to talk to you my whole life." Lily's face crumpled with a grief that was all the more heartbreaking for being painted. "My baby, my little boy. What happened to you? Where are you? This looks like Hogwarts, but you're too young to be a student." The questions came in a rush, and Harry found himself pouring out the story he had never been able to tell anyone who would truly understand. He told her about the Dursleys, about the cupboard, and the hunger, and the casual cruelty that had defined his earliest years. He told her about Dobby's rescue, about the room that had become his sanctuary, about the 4 years of hidden life that had given him education and safety, but no companionship. With each revelation, Lily's expression grew more horrified, more heartbroken. By the time Harry finished, she was openly weeping, her painted tears somehow managing to convey the depth of a mother's anguish at her child's suffering. "The Dursleys," she said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I knew Petunia didn't like me, but I never imagined. She was my sister, Harry, my only family after our parents died. I hoped that blood would mean something to her." "Dobby says Dumbledore put me there," Harry said quietly. "He says there were special protections that only worked if I lived with your family." Lily's face went very still at the mention of Dumbledore's name. "Blood wards," she said slowly. "Yes, I remember Dumbledore mentioning those, the protection of a mother's sacrifice, anchored in her blood and extending to her relatives." She looked at Harry with growing understanding and horror. "Or he placed you with the Dursleys because of the blood connection, because he believed it would keep you safe." "But I wasn't safe," Harry said, and the simple statement carried all the pain of his early childhood. "They hurt me. They locked me up and starved me, and told me I was worthless and strange and unwanted. Oh, my darling boy." Lily pressed her painted hands against the glass that separated them, as if she could somehow reach through and comfort him. "That was never supposed to happen. Albus would never have intended for you to be mistreated. He must have believed. He must have thought they would care for you properly." "But they didn't," Harry said, and he was surprised by the anger in his own voice. "They didn't care for me at all, and Dumbledore never checked, never came to see how I was doing, never made sure the people he trusted with me were actually trustworthy." Lily was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of what Harry was telling her. "Albus Dumbledore is a great wizard," she said finally. "One of the greatest of our time. But he sometimes sees the larger picture so clearly that he loses sight of the smaller, human details. He would have focused on keeping you alive and missed the importance of keeping you happy." "Happy?" Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think happiness ever entered into his calculations. Dobby told me stories about what Dumbledore said, that suffering would make me stronger, that I needed to understand hardship to appreciate what I was fighting for." The color drained from Lily's painted face. "He said that? About you, specifically?" "Not about me directly," Harry admitted, "but about children like me. Children who were destined for difficult things. Dobby heard him talking to other teachers about how adversity builds character." "Adversity, yes," Lily said fiercely. "Challenge and difficulty, and the need to work for what you achieve. Not abuse, Harry. Not neglect and cruelty and deliberate harm. There's a vast difference between facing hardship and being subjected to systematic mistreatment." Harry stared at her, seeing something in her painted features that he recognized from his own mirror, a stubborn refusal to accept injustice, even when it came wrapped in good intentions. "Do you think he knew?" Harry asked quietly. "About how they were treating me?" Lily considered the question seriously before answering. "I think Albus knew that the Dursleys didn't like magic or magical people. I think he believed that would make them distant, perhaps. Cold. But I don't think he understood the depth of their hatred or their capacity for cruelty. Albus has spent his entire adult life surrounded by magical people who, whatever their other faults, understand that magical children need care and guidance. He may not have been able to imagine the kind of systematic abuse you experienced." "So it was an accident," Harry said bitterly. "My whole horrible childhood was just an oversight." "An inexcusable oversight," Lily said firmly. "Harry, listen to me. What happened to you was wrong. The way the Dursleys treated you was wrong. Dumbledore's failure to protect you was wrong. None of those things were your fault, and none of them were acceptable, regardless of the intentions behind them." The validation hit Harry like a physical blow. For 10 years he had carried the weight of believing, on some fundamental level, that his suffering had been deserved, that he was strange and wrong and fundamentally unlovable. Hearing his mother, his actual mother, who knew him and chose to love him, say definitively that he had been wronged was both liberating and overwhelming. "But you're free now," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're safe and fed and educated, and from what I can see, you're growing into exactly the kind of person your father and I hoped you would become. Intelligent, thoughtful, questioning when something doesn't seem right." "But I'm still alone," Harry said, and the words came out smaller and more vulnerable than he had intended. "I have Dobby, and he's wonderful, but I don't have any friends. I don't have anyone to talk to or play with or just be with. Sometimes I think the loneliness is almost as bad as the cupboard was." Lily's expression softened with infinite compassion. "Oh, sweetheart, you're not meant to be alone. Children need other children, need friends and playmates, and all the complicated social connections that help them learn how to be human. What you're feeling isn't weakness, it's a natural, healthy need that's not being met." "Dobby says it's too dangerous for me to be around other people," Harry said. "He says there are still people who want to hurt me because of who I am and what I represent." "There may be some truth to that," Lily admitted. "But there's also truth in the fact that you're dying inside from isolation. Harry, you're not just the boy who lived. You're a 10-year-old child who deserves to have a childhood. Not a perfect one, maybe, but a real one, with friends and teachers and all the normal experiences that help children grow into healthy adults." Harry felt tears start to flow down his cheeks. "I don't know how to change things. I don't know how to have a normal life without putting Dobby in danger or exposing myself to people who might want to hurt me." "You don't have to figure it out alone," Lily said gently. "Harry, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to help you understand your heritage, your power, and your choices. I can't hold you or hug you or make up for the years of affection you've missed, but I can give you the knowledge you need to make informed decisions about your own life." "You can do that?" Hope flickered in Harry's chest, fragile but real. "I can tell you about your father and me. I can help you understand the magic you've inherited and why your power has developed the way it has. I can share the values and principles that we tried to live by, so you can decide whether they're worth carrying forward." Lily's painted face was fierce with determination. "Most importantly, I can remind you every day that you are deeply, completely, unconditionally loved." Harry pressed his own hands against the glass, mirroring his mother's gesture. "I've dreamed about having someone say that to me. Then dream no more, my darling boy. You are loved. You have always been loved. And now that we've found each other, I'm going to make sure you never doubt that again." For the first time in his life, Harry Potter fell asleep to the sound of his mother's voice, singing him lullabies she had learned from her own mother, promising him stories about his father's mischievous school days and assuring him over and over that he was precious beyond measure. The room, sensing the profound healing that was beginning to take place, settled into a peaceful quiet around them, finally able to provide the one thing it had never been able to manifest before: a mother's love. But outside their sanctuary, in the shadowed corners of Malfoy Manor, Dobby was facing increasingly pointed questions about his mysterious absences, and time was running shorter with each passing day. Of the healing that had begun in the Room of Requirement would soon be tested by forces beyond their control, and the question that haunted the space between worlds was whether Harry's newfound connection to his mother's love would be enough to sustain him through the trials that lay ahead. In her frame, Lily Potter gazed down at her sleeping son and whispered fierce promises of protection and guidance, even as she wondered whether a portrait's love could ever be enough to heal a lifetime of wounds. Chapter 10. The Summons. July 31st, 1991, dawned bright and clear over the Scottish Highlands, sunlight streaming through the windows of the Room of Requirement to illuminate what had become over 5 extraordinary years, both sanctuary and prison, for the most famous child in the wizarding world. Harry Potter woke on his 11th birthday to find his room transformed once again. The walls had taken on a festive golden hue, and the air sparkled with tiny floating lights that danced like captured fireflies. A small table near his bed held a birthday cake that looked suspiciously like something Dobby might have borrowed from the Hogwarts kitchens, complete with 11 candles that flickered with rainbow-coloured flames. But it was not the room's celebration that made Harry's heart race with anticipation and dread. It was the official-looking envelope that sat propped against the cake, addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. H. Potter, the Room of Requirement, 7th floor, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Harry stared at the letter for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. That someone, presumably the school itself, knew exactly where he was, had known, perhaps, all along. The carefully maintained secret that had protected him for 5 years suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. "Dobby," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The house elf appeared instantly, his large eyes bright with an emotion that might have been excitement or terror, possibly both. "Harry Potter's Hogwarts letter has arrived," Dobby said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this moment had been anticipated for some time. "You knew," Harry said, not quite an accusation, but close to it. "You knew this would happen." "Dobby has been preparing," the house elf admitted, wringing his hands nervously. "Hogwarts letters arrive for all magical children on their 11th birthday. Dobby has been watching the calendar, counting the days, trying to decide what would be best for Harry Potter when this moment came." Harry picked up the envelope with careful reverence, feeling the weight of parchment and sealing wax that represented everything he had dreamed of and everything he feared. His name was written in elegant script, but it was the address that made his breath catch. Not a vague approximation or a best guess, but his exact location within the castle, as if whoever had written it possessed intimate knowledge of his circumstances. "How do they know?" Harry asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Hogwarts knows all of its students," Dobby said carefully. "The school itself is very old, very magical. It has ways of finding children who belong to it, no matter where they might be hiding." Harry broke the wax seal with fingers that shook only slightly and unfolded the letter within. The words were exactly what he had expected from his years of reading about Hogwarts, yet seeing them addressed to him personally made them feel like the most important document in the world. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sorcerer, Chief Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Confederation of Wizards. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by no later than July 31st. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall. Deputy Headmistress attached was the supply list, filled with items that seemed both wonderfully exotic and comfortingly familiar after years of studying similar materials, spell books and cauldrons, telescopes and sets of scales, and at the bottom, the note that made Harry's heart leap with longing. Students may also bring an owl or a cat or a toad. "I could go," Harry said aloud, and the words tasted like possibility and terror in equal measure. "I could actually go to Hogwarts, not as a hidden observer, but as a real student." From her portrait in the corner, Lily Potter had been watching the scene unfold with growing excitement and maternal pride. "Harry, sweetheart, this is what we always wanted for you. A chance at a normal, magical education, surrounded by children your own age." "But it won't be normal," Harry said, and all the arguments he had been rehearsing in his mind for years came tumbling out. "Everyone will know who I am. They'll expect me to be this heroic figure, this symbol of their victory over Voldemort. They'll want to touch my scar and ask me about defeating the Dark Lord, and I don't remember any of it. I was just a baby." "So you tell them that," Lily said firmly. "You tell them you're just Harry, that you want to learn and make friends, and have the same experiences as everyone else. Most children are kinder and more understanding than you might expect, especially if you're honest with them." "And what about where I've been living?" Harry continued, his voice rising with anxiety. "What do I tell people when they ask about my family, my childhood, why I know so much magic already? The whole wizarding world has been looking for me for 5 years. If I just show up at Hogwarts as if nothing happened, there will be questions, investigations. People will want answers I can't give without putting Dobby in terrible danger." Dobby's ears drooped at this, and Harry immediately felt guilty for his outburst. None of this was Dobby's fault. The house elf had given up everything, safety, security, peace of mind, to save and care for him. The last thing Harry wanted was to sound ungrateful. "Dobby has been thinking about this problem for many months," the house elf said quietly. Perhaps Harry Potter could say that he was taken in by a magical family who preferred to remain private, was a family that educated him at home and has now decided he is ready for formal schooling. "That's not exactly a lie," Lily observed from her portrait. "Dobby has been your family, in all the ways that matter. And you have been educated at home, just not in the traditional sense." Harry looked around the room that had been his entire world for half a decade, at the books that had taught him magic far beyond his years, at the comfortable furniture that had provided security, at the portraits and magical objects that had been his only companions aside from Dobby. It was a beautiful prison, filled with love and learning, but it was still a prison. "I want to go," he said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in his mind with startling clarity. "I want to go to Hogwarts and learn with other students and make friends and have all the experiences I've been reading about. I want to eat in the Great Hall and sleep in a dormitory and worry about homework instead of whether anyone will ever want to talk to me." Dobby's face lit up with such joy that he seemed to glow from within. "Harry Potter wants to go to school?" "I do," Harry said, and felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. "I'm terrified, and I have no idea how to act around other children, and I'm going to have to lie about where I've been living, but I can't stay hidden forever. And maybe it's time I stopped being so afraid of the world outside this room." As if responding to his decision, the room began to transform around them. Shelves appeared along the walls. They filled with precisely the items listed on Harry's supply list. School robes in his size hung from a wardrobe that materialized near the window. Books, new copies, not the well-worn library volumes he was accustomed to, arranged themselves on the desk in neat stacks. But most remarkably, a small pile of gold coins appeared on the table beside his birthday cake. "Dobby," Harry said slowly, staring at the money. "Where did this come from?" The house elf's ears turned pink with embarrassment. "Dobby has been borrowing small amounts from the Malfoy family vault over the years. Just a few coins here and there, never enough to be noticed. Dobby told himself it was payment for extra services, to compensation for the additional work of caring for Harry Potter, while still maintaining his duties to his official family." "You've been stealing money for me?" Harry asked, though he felt more touched than scandalized. "Dobby prefers to think of it as delayed salary negotiations," the house elf said primly. "The Malfoys have never paid Dobby fairly for his services. A few galleons over 5 years seems a reasonable adjustment to his compensation package." Lily's portrait was practically beaming with approval. "I like this house elf more and more," she said. "James would have found that reasoning absolutely brilliant." Harry picked up one of the gold coins, marveling at its weight and the way it caught the light. Real wizard money, earned through Dobby's sacrifice and cleverness, enough to buy everything he needed for his first year at Hogwarts, and possibly beyond. "There's enough here for everything on the list," Harry said, running calculations in his head based on the prices he had seen mentioned in various books. Books, robes, cauldron, wand. A wand, Dobby said significantly. Harry Potter will need to visit Diagon Alley to purchase a proper wand from Mr. Ollivander. The thought of leaving not just the room, but Hogwarts itself, made Harry's stomach flutter with nervousness. In 5 years, he had never been further from his sanctuary than the castle library. The idea of navigating the wizarding world's main shopping district, surrounded by strangers who might recognize him, felt overwhelming. "I'll go with you," Lily said from her portrait, as if she could read his thoughts. "Not physically, of course, but I can prepare you. Tell you about the shops, the people you might encounter, the protocols for interacting with the wizarding public. And Dobby will be watching from the shadows," the house elf added. "Harry Potter will never be truly alone, even when he thinks he is." Harry spent the rest of his birthday afternoon practicing conversations with the various portraits that had appeared in the room over the years, preparing for the social interactions that had been theoretical for so long, but were about to become terrifyingly real. He practiced introducing himself, deflecting questions about his past, and projecting the kind of confident normalcy he hoped would discourage excessive curiosity. But as the day drew toward evening, one crucial decision remained. "What do I tell them about my relatives?" Harry asked, looking between Dobby and Lily's portrait. "The official story has always been that I was placed with my aunt and uncle after my parents died. If I show up claiming to have been raised by some mysterious private family, people are going to ask what happened to the Dursleys." Lily's expression grew thoughtful. "You tell them a version of the truth," she said finally, "that your relatives were unsuitable guardians, and that arrangements were made for you to be cared for by people who could provide a better environment for your magical development. Most people in the wizarding world understand that not all Muggle families are equipped to handle magical children. And if they ask for specifics, you tell them it's private family business that you prefer not to discuss," Dobby said firmly. "No one has the right to demand details about Harry Potter's personal circumstances, no matter how curious they might be." As night fell over the castle, Harry made his final preparations. He wrote his acceptance letter to Professor McGonagall, confirming his intention to attend Hogwarts. He packed the few personal belongings he wanted to take with him, mostly books and the small mementos Dobby had given him over the years. He said goodnight to Lily's portrait, who promised to be there when he returned from his shopping expedition. But most importantly, he made peace with the decision that would change everything. For 5 years, he had been Harry Potter, the hidden boy, the missing hero, the child who existed in the spaces between what people expected and what they could find. Tomorrow, he would begin the transformation into someone new. Harry Potter, the student, the friend, the young man who would write his own story rather than living in the shadow of what others had written for him. "Are you ready, Harry Potter?" Dobby asked as they prepared for sleep. Harry looked around the room one last time, memorizing every detail of the space that had saved his life and shaped his character. Tomorrow would bring changes that none of them could predict, challenges that would test everything he had learned about magic and courage, and the complex art of being human. "I'm ready," he said, and for the first time in his life, he truly meant it. The boy who had once hidden in cupboards was about to walk openly through the halls of the most famous magical school in the world, and despite all the risks and uncertainties that lay ahead, Harry Potter had never been more excited about anything in his life. Chapter 11. The Sorting Crisis. September 1st, 1991, dawned crisp and clear, carrying with it the promise of change that Harry Potter had been both anticipating and dreading for months. Though standing on platform 9 3/4 with his trunk and owl cage, containing a beautiful snowy owl he had named Hedwig after reading about her in a medieval history text, Harry felt like he was stepping into a story he had been reading about his entire life, but had never expected to actually experience. The carefully constructed identity he and Dobby had crafted felt fragile in the bright morning light. Harry Potter, orphaned at 15 months, raised by a private wizarding family who preferred their anonymity, now ready to begin his proper magical education at Hogwarts. It was close enough to the truth to feel authentic, while remaining vague enough to discourage detailed questions. At least he hoped it would. The Hogwarts Express gleamed scarlet in the morning sun, steam billowing from its engine as families said their goodbyes all around him. Harry watched the interactions with fascination and a pang of longing. Parents hugging their children, siblings offering last-minute advice, the casual intimacy of families who took their love for granted. He had Dobby's blessing, whispered to him that morning in the room of requirement, and Lily's portrait had spent the previous evening coaching him on everything from proper introductions to table manners. But standing here surrounded by the warm chaos of family farewells, Harry had never felt more alone or more aware of what he had missed. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him, and Harry turned to see a girl about his own age, with bushy brown hair and bright, intelligent eyes. She was practically vibrating with excitement and nervous energy. "Are you a first year too? I'm Hermione Granger. I've read all about Hogwarts, of course, but I'm still terribly nervous about the whole thing." Harry's heart jumped with the realization that this was it, his first real conversation with someone his own age in 5 years. All those hours practicing with portraits suddenly felt woefully inadequate. "Harry Potter," he said, extending his hand with what he hoped was appropriate formality. "And yes, first year. Though I have to admit, I'm nervous too." Hermione's eyes widened at his name, and Harry braced himself for the inevitable questions about his fame, his scar, his miraculous survival as a baby. But instead she surprised him. "Oh, I've read about you, of course, but I thought, well, everyone said you disappeared years ago. Where have you been? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." The Daily Prophet had all sorts of theories, but none of them seemed very reliable. It was exactly the question Harry had been preparing for, but hearing it asked by someone with genuine curiosity rather than morbid fascination made it easier to answer. "I was raised by a wizarding family who valued their privacy," Harry said, the practiced words rolling off his tongue smoothly. "They provided an excellent education, but preferred to stay out of the public eye. I'm sure you can understand why someone might want to avoid the attention that comes with being associated with, well, with me." Hermione nodded thoughtfully, and Harry was relieved to see understanding rather than suspicion in her expression. "That makes perfect sense. The wizarding press can be rather intrusive, can't it? Well, I think it's wonderful that you're here now. I've been looking forward to meeting other students who actually care about learning." As they boarded the train together, Harry felt a flutter of hope. This girl, Hermione, seemed more interested in books and learning than in his celebrity status. Perhaps making friends wouldn't be as difficult as he had feared. They found an empty compartment and settled in as the train began to move. Within minutes, they were joined by a red-haired boy with a friendly face and clothes that had clearly seen better days. "Mind if I sit here?" the boy asked, gesturing at the empty seats. "Everywhere else is full. I'm Ron Weasley, by the way." "Hermione Granger," Hermione said promptly. "Harry Potter," Harry added, watching Ron's reaction carefully. Ron's eyes went immediately to Harry's forehead, where his lightning bolt scar was partially visible beneath his fringe. "Blimey," he breathed. "Are you really? I mean, do you really have the scar?" Harry pushed his hair back, revealing the distinctive mark that had made him famous. "Yes, it's really me. Though I have to warn you, I don't remember anything about that night, and I'm really not as interesting as the stories make me sound." "Are you kidding?" Ron's face lit up with excitement. "You're the most famous wizard in Britain. Everyone knows your name. My mum's been following every story about your disappearance for years." "Which is exactly why I've been trying to stay out of the spotlight," Harry said, but he was smiling, Ron's enthusiasm was infectious rather than overwhelming, and there was something refreshingly honest about his reaction. As the train journey progressed, Harry found himself marveling at how natural conversation could feel when it flowed freely between people who genuinely liked each other. Hermione peppered him with questions about his education, clearly impressed by his knowledge of magical theory. Ron regaled them with stories about his large family and life in the wizarding world, filling in gaps in Harry's understanding that even 5 years of intensive study hadn't covered. But it was when the conversation turned to practical magic that Harry realized how much his unusual upbringing showed. "I've been trying to practice simple spells all summer," Hermione was saying, pulling out her wand. "I can do a few basic ones, but nothing too complicated. What about you, Harry?" Harry hesitated for a moment, then decided that some demonstration was inevitable. "I've had pretty thorough instruction," he said carefully. "My guardians believed in starting magical education early." He pulled out his wand, the holly and phoenix feather wand he had purchased in Diagon Alley just days before, though he had been using wandless magic for years, and performed a simple color-changing charm on one of the seat cushions. Both Ron and Hermione stared in amazement, not because the spell was particularly impressive, but because Harry had performed it with the casual precision of someone for whom magic was as natural as breathing. "How did you make it look so easy?" Hermione asked, clearly frustrated by her own struggles with similar spells. "Practice," Harry said simply, which was true enough. Well, lots and lots of practice. What he didn't mention was that the spell he had just performed was among the simplest in his repertoire, that he could have transfigured the entire compartment if he had wanted to, or that his magical education had been conducted by a house elf in a hidden room rather than by conventional tutors. The closer they got to Hogwarts, the more Harry began to understand how much his isolation had affected him in ways beyond mere loneliness. Simple social interactions that Ron and Hermione navigated effortlessly, sharing sweets, casual teasing, the comfortable silences that developed between friends, felt like foreign territory to him. He found himself analyzing every exchange, uncertain whether his responses were appropriate or natural. But despite his social awkwardness, while by the time the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station, Harry felt something he had never experienced before. The warm glow of belonging somewhere, of being part of a group that accepted him for who he was, rather than what he represented. "Furs years! Furs years over here!" called a booming voice, and Harry looked up to see the largest man he had ever encountered, holding a lantern and gesturing for the new students to gather around him. "That's Hagrid," Ron whispered, as they made their way over. "He's the keeper of keys and grounds. Bit odd, but harmless enough." Harry studied the giant man with interest, remembering references to Hagrid in some of the books he had read. There was something inherently trustworthy about his broad face and kind eyes, and Harry found himself looking forward to getting to know him better. The boat ride across the lake was magical, in a way that even Harry's extensive reading hadn't prepared him for. The castle rose before them like something from a fairy tale, its towers and battlements glowing with warm light against the star-filled sky. But more than the visual spectacle, it was the feeling of homecoming that overwhelmed him, the sense that after 11 years of life and 5 years of hiding, he was finally exactly where he belonged. The great hall took his breath away. The floating candles, the enchanted ceiling that showed the night sky, the 4 long house tables filled with students. Everything was exactly as he had imagined it, but somehow more real and immediate than any description could have conveyed. But it was the sight of the sorting hat sitting on its stool that made Harry's stomach clench with sudden nervousness. All his preparation, all his careful planning about how to present himself, would ultimately be secondary to whatever that ancient magical artifact decided about his character and potential. "When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool to be sorted into your houses," Professor McGonagall announced, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space. Harry watched as his new friends were called forward. Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor with barely a pause, the hat seeming to recognize her courage and determination immediately. Ron followed shortly after, also placed in Gryffindor after what appeared to be a brief internal debate. And then, Potter. "Harry!" The whispers that swept through the great hall were exactly what Harry had expected and dreaded. He walked to the stool on legs that felt distinctly unsteady, acutely aware of hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on him, with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe to calculation. Professor McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and immediately Harry's world narrowed to the voice that spoke directly into his mind. "Well, well, well," the Sorting Hat said, and Harry could hear amusement in its mental tone. "Harry Potter, I wondered when you would find your way to me, young man. Though I must say, you are not at all what I expected." What did you expect? Harry thought back. A traumatized child, most likely. Someone marked by suffering and loss, perhaps with a tendency toward anger or desperate need for approval. Instead, I find a mind shaped by love and careful teaching, advanced beyond its years but remarkably well balanced. Most curious indeed. The hat paused, and Harry could sense it sifting through his thoughts and memories with gentle thoroughness. 5 years in the Room of Requirement, it continued thoughtfully. Educated by a house elf whose devotion borders on the legendary, protected and nurtured, and given everything he needed, except companionship with his own kind. No wonder you feel both exceptionally prepared and completely unprepared for what lies ahead. "Can you see everything?" Harry asked, suddenly worried about what secrets might be revealed. "I can see what shapes you, child. Your love for the creature who saved you. Your grief for the mother whose portrait has become your guide. Your determination to prove worthy of the sacrifices made on your behalf. And yes, I can see the darker gifts that mark you, the parcel-tongue ability that connects you to powers you don't yet understand." Harry's blood ran cold. "Am I dark? Does that ability make me evil?" "Magic is neither good nor evil, Harry Potter. It simply is. But I will tell you this. The darkness I sense in you is not of your making. It is a scar as surely as the one on your forehead, a mark left by forces you could not control. What matters is not that it exists, but what you choose to do with it." The hat was quiet for a long moment, and Harry became aware that the sorting was taking much longer than usual. He could hear restless murmuring from the assembled students and teachers. "You present me with a fascinating puzzle," the hat said finally. "You have the courage of Gryffindor, demonstrated not in moments of reckless bravery, but in your willingness to step into the unknown despite your fears. You have the wisdom of Ravenclaw, cultivated through years of intensive study and deep thinking. You have the loyalty of Hufflepuff, shown in your devotion to those who have cared for you. And yes, you even have the ambition of Slytherin, though your goals are noble rather than self-serving. So where do I belong?" "Where you choose to belong, young man. Your character has been shaped by love rather than by house traditions. You will carry the best of all 4 houses with you, regardless of where I place you." The hat paused again. "But I think, yes, I think your path lies with those who value courage above all else. Not because you are reckless, but because you have already shown that you are willing to face difficult truths and make hard choices when they are necessary. Gryffindor!" the hat announced aloud, and the great hall erupted in cheers from the red and gold table. But as Professor McGonagall removed the hat from Harry's head, he heard one final whisper that only he could perceive. "We will speak again, Mr. Potter. There are things you will need to know that cannot be learned from books or portraits, or even the most devoted house elf. When you are ready for those truths, you will find me." Harry made his way to the Gryffindor table on shaking legs, still processing the hat's words. But as he sat down between Ron and Hermione, both of whom greeted him with enthusiastic congratulations, he felt the last of his nervousness fade away. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by friends, in a house that valued the courage he had been quietly developing for years, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that was finally, truly his own to write. "Welcome to Gryffindor, Harry," Hermione said, raising her goblet of pumpkin juice in a toast. "Welcome home," Ron added with a grin. And as Harry raised his own goblet to meet theirs, he realized that Ron was absolutely right. After 11 years of searching, he had finally found his way home. Chapter 12. Truth and Consequences. 2 weeks into his first term at Hogwarts, Harry Potter had discovered that hiding 5 years of advanced magical education was considerably more difficult than he had anticipated. It had started small, offering to help Neville Longbottom with a transfiguration assignment, and inadvertently demonstrating techniques that wouldn't normally be taught until 3rd year. Answering questions in defense against the dark arts, with theoretical knowledge that impressed even Professor Quirrell. Brewing a perfect cure for boils in his first potions class, while Snape looked on with barely concealed suspicion. But it was during a particularly challenging transfiguration lesson that Harry's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled entirely. Professor McGonagall had assigned the class the task of turning a mouse into a snuffbox, magic that was ambitious even for first-year students, and typically required multiple attempts over several weeks to master. Harry watched his classmates struggle with the complex wand movements and precise mental imaging required, their mice occasionally sprouting small hinges or developing wooden patches, but rarely achieving full transformation. "Remember," McGonagall said, walking between the desks to observe their progress, "transfiguration requires absolute concentration. You must visualize exactly what you want the object to become, down to the smallest detail. Any uncertainty in your mind will result in incomplete transformation." Harry looked down at his mouse, which was sitting quite contentedly in his palm. The transformation McGonagall was asking for was actually relatively simple. He had mastered similar spells years ago under Dobby's patient instruction, but performing it would reveal knowledge far beyond what any first year should possess. "Harry," Hermione whispered from the desk beside him, "are you going to try? Your mouse hasn't changed at all." Around them, other students were making progress. Ron's mouse had developed small brass corners, and Hermione's was beginning to take on a distinctly box-like appearance, though it still retained its tail and whiskers. Harry made his decision. He was tired of pretending to struggle with magic that felt as natural as breathing. If questions were asked, he would deal with them. He raised his wand, visualized the snuffbox in perfect detail: mahogany wood, brass fittings, velvet interior, small key, and spoke the incantation with quiet confidence. The transformation was instantaneous and flawless. Where his mouse had been sitting moments before, as there was now an exquisite snuff-box that looked like it belonged in an expensive jewelry store. The wood gleamed with a rich, warm patina, the brass fittings were perfectly polished, and when Harry opened it, the interior was lined with deep blue velvet. The classroom fell silent. Professor McGonagall approached Harry's desk with measured steps, her expression unreadable. She picked up the snuff-box and examined it with the thoroughness of someone who had been teaching transfiguration for decades. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "this is ANEWT level work. The precision of the transformation, the attention to detail, the complete absence of any hybrid characteristics. This is magic that 7th-year students struggle to achieve." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks as every eye in the classroom fixed on him. I've always been good with transfiguration, Professor." "Good with transfiguration?" McGonagall's voice carried a sharp edge of disbelief. "Mr. Potter, this level of skill requires years of instruction and practice. Where exactly did you receive your magical education before coming to Hogwarts?" The question Harry had been dreading hung in the air between them. Around the classroom, his fellow students leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Even Hermione was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly realizing that her new friend possessed abilities far beyond anything she had imagined. "I was tutored privately," Harry said carefully. "My guardians believed in comprehensive magical education." "Tutored by whom?" McGonagall's tone suggested she would not be satisfied with vague answers. Harry opened his mouth to repeat his practiced story about mysterious private tutors, but the words wouldn't come. Looking into Professor McGonagall's stern but caring eyes, he found himself unable to continue the deception that had become increasingly burdensome over the past 2 weeks. "I think," he said quietly, "that might be a conversation better suited to your office, Professor." 20 minutes later, Harry sat in Professor McGonagall's office, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than he had in years. The room was filled with the quiet authority of decades of teaching, and McGonagall herself radiated the kind of moral certainty that made lying feel not just difficult, but actively harmful. "Mr. Potter," she said, settling behind her desk with the air of someone prepared to get to the bottom of a mystery, "I have been teaching at this school for nearly 40 years. In that time, I have seen exceptionally talented students, prodigies and children, raised in the most magically saturated environments imaginable. None of them have demonstrated the level of advanced knowledge and practical skill that you displayed in class today." She paused, studying his face with the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to seeing through student deceptions. "More importantly," she continued, "the Daily Prophet has been full of speculation about your whereabouts for the past 5 years. You disappeared from your relative's home when you were 6 years old. The most intensive search in modern wizarding history failed to locate you, and now you appear at Hogwarts, claiming to have been privately educated, or with magical abilities that would be remarkable in an adult wizard." Harry said nothing, recognizing that any response he gave would only dig him deeper into an untenable position. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, Mr. Potter, and I expect a direct answer. Where have you been living for the past 5 years?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications that would change everything regardless of how Harry responded. He thought of Dobby, probably at this very moment dealing with the Malfoys' increasingly suspicious questions. He thought of the Room of Requirement, the sanctuary that had saved his life and shaped his character. He thought of the careful lies he had constructed to protect everyone he cared about, and he made a choice that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "I think," Harry said carefully, "that you should summon Professor Dumbledore and the Sorting Hat. This is a conversation that requires more than just the two of us." Albus Dumbledore's office felt different when filled with tension rather than its usual quiet authority. Harry sat in a chair facing the headmaster's desk, acutely aware that his world was about to change irrevocably. Professor McGonagall stood near the window, her expression hovering between concern and barely controlled anger. The Sorting Hat sat on its usual shelf, looking deceptively ordinary, despite being perhaps the most important witness in the room. "Mr. Potter," Dumbledore said gently, his blue eyes reflecting what might have been sadness or regret. "Minerva tells me that you have something you wish to share with us. Or something that might explain the remarkable magical abilities you have displayed." "Before we begin," Harry said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice, "I need to know something. How long have you known where I was?" Dumbledore's pause was telling. "What makes you think I knew?" "My Hogwarts letter was addressed to the Room of Requirement, 7th floor," Harry said simply. "Either the school's magic is far more comprehensive than anyone realizes, or someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's secrets has been aware of my location for some time." "The Room of Requirement," McGonagall breathed, her hand rising to her throat. "Harry, you can't mean—" "I have been living in the Room of Requirement for 5 years, 3 months, and 16 days, Harry said quietly. "Since the night a house elf named Dobby rescued me from my relative's house and brought me to the safest place he could think of." The silence that followed was deafening. Dumbledore was the first to speak, and his voice carried a weight of shock that Harry had never heard from the great wizard before. Living in the room of requirement for 5 years, under the care of a house elf. "Dobby saved my life," Harry said, and he could not keep the fierce protectiveness out of his voice. "He found me locked in a cupboard, starving and beaten, and he risked everything to give me a chance at something better." "A cupboard?" McGonagall's voice was sharp with outrage. "Harry, what exactly were your relatives doing to you?" For the next 20 minutes, Harry told them everything. The cupboard under the stairs, the casual cruelty and systematic neglect, the years of being told he was worthless and strange and unwanted. He spoke with the clinical detachment he had learned from his mother's portrait, laying out facts without drowning in the emotions they carried. When he finished, McGonagall was openly weeping, and even Dumbledore looked older and more fragile than Harry had ever seen him. "I'm sorry," Dumbledore said finally, and the words seemed inadequate even to him. "Harry, I am more sorry than you can possibly know. I placed you with your relatives believing that Petunia's blood would provide protection and that family bonds, however strained, would ensure basic care. I was catastrophically wrong on both counts." "You never checked," Harry said, and he was surprised to find that his voice held disappointment rather than anger. "In 5 years, you never once came to see how I was doing. Never verified that the people you trusted with the boy who lived were actually trustworthy. I monitored you with magical means," Dumbledore said, though his tone suggested he knew how inadequate this sounded. "The blood ward remained strong, indicating that you were alive and present at Privet Drive. I interpreted its stability as evidence that you were, well cared for." "The blood ward," Harry said, and understanding dawned in his eyes. "That's why Dobby was so careful about how he rescued me. He didn't take me away from the Dursleys permanently. He made sure I still had a connection to that place, didn't he? That's why your monitoring never failed." From the shelf, the Sorting Hat spoke for the first time since the conversation began. "The boy is correct, Albus. The house elf was remarkably clever in his methods. He maintained the technical requirements of the blood protection while removing the child from actual danger. It was elegant magic, carefully planned, and flawlessly executed." "You knew," Dumbledore said, looking at the hat with growing realization. "During the sorting, you sensed what had happened." "I sensed a child whose magical development was far beyond normal parameters," the hat replied. "Educated with love and patience, protected and nurtured, but carrying the distinctive magical signature of someone who had spent years in the room of requirement. I chose not to reveal this information because I judged that the boy had been better served by his unconventional guardianship than he would have been by more traditional arrangements." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing implications that stretched far beyond this single conversation. "Harry," he said finally, "I need to ask you about the magical disturbances that have been detected throughout the castle over the past several years. Incidents of unexplained magical resonance, effects on portraits and magical artifacts." "That was me," Harry admitted. "As I got older and my magic got stronger, it became harder to contain, especially when I was upset or frustrated. I'm sorry if it caused problems." "Problems?" Dumbledore's voice carried a note of amazement. "Harry, some of those magical surges were powerful enough to set off every detection charm in the castle. We've been investigating them for years, trying to determine their source." "I was trying to be careful," Harry said defensively. "Dobby taught me control techniques, and the room usually absorbed most of the excess energy. But sometimes you were a child dealing with emotions too big for any containment system to handle," McGonagall said gently. "Harry, the fact that you maintained any control at all under those circumstances is remarkable." A soft pop announced the arrival of someone else in the office, and Harry's heart sank as he saw Dobby materialize near the door. The house elf looked terrified, but determined, his large eyes fixed on Harry with desperate concern. "Dobby felt Harry Potter's distress," the house elf said, wringing his hands nervously. Dobby came to make sure Harry Potter was safe. Dobby, Dumbledore said gently, we know what you have done, all of it. The rescue, the care, what the years of protection and education you have provided. Dobby's ears flattened against his skull, and he began to tremble visibly. Dobby is ready to accept punishment for his disobedience. But Dobby regrets nothing. Harry Potter needed help, and Dobby helped him. Dobby would do it again. Punishment? McGonagall stood up so quickly her chair fell over. Mr. Dobby, you have just demonstrated the kind of moral courage and selfless devotion that we spend years trying to teach our students. The idea that you should be punished for saving a child from abuse and neglect is absolutely unconscionable. But Dobby disobeyed his masters, Dobby said, confusion evident in his voice. Dobby used magic and resources that belonged to the Malfoy family, and Dobby lied and stole and kept secrets from his proper owners. Your proper owners, Dumbledore said quietly, have forfeited any claim to your loyalty through their association with dark magic and their indifference to the welfare of children. Dobby, if you are willing, I would like to offer you a position here at Hogwarts. A paid position, with proper quarters, and the respect due to someone who has performed such extraordinary service. Dobby stared at Dumbledore for a moment, then burst into tears of joy. Professor Dumbledore means Dobby would be free. Dobby could work for wages and have his own clothes and make his own choices. If that is what you want, yes. Harry watched this exchange with a growing sense of relief and gratitude. For 5 years, Dobby had sacrificed everything to care for him. To see the house elf finally receiving recognition and the chance for a better life felt like justice long overdue. And Harry Potter? Dobby asked, looking between the professors with obvious worry. What will happen to Harry Potter? Will he be in trouble for keeping Dobby's secrets? Harry will continue his education here at Hogwarts, Dumbledore said firmly. He will live in Gryffindor Tower with his classmates, attend regular classes, and have all the normal experiences of a Hogwarts student. The room of requirement will always be available to him when he needs solitude or a connection to the place that sheltered him, but his primary residence will be among his peers. Harry felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. And the questions? The investigations? That people are going to want to know where I've been, what happened to me. We will release a carefully worded statement explaining that you were placed in protective custody after it became clear that your original guardians were unsuitable, McGonagall said. The details will remain private, as is appropriate for matters involving the welfare of children. Those who need to know the truth will be informed. Others will have to be satisfied with assurances that you are safe and well-educated. And the Malfoys? Harry asked, thinking of the family that had unwittingly provided for his upbringing through Dobby's careful management of resources. Will be informed that their house elf has been lawfully freed due to circumstances beyond their control, Dumbledore said, and there was steel in his voice. Lucius Malfoy may suspect the truth, but he will find no proof and no legal recourse. Dobby's actions, while technically theft, were performed in service of protecting a child from abuse. No court in the wizarding world would prosecute such a case. As the meeting drew to a close, Harry found himself marveling at how much his life had changed in the span of a single afternoon. The secrets that had defined his existence for 5 years were finally in the open. The lies that had weighed on his conscience were no longer necessary. The isolation that had both protected and imprisoned him was finally over. One last thing, Dumbledore said as they prepared to leave. Harry, I want you to know that while I deeply regret the circumstances that led to your unconventional upbringing, I cannot regret the person it has helped you become. You have been shaped by love rather than duty, and by curiosity rather than expectation. You possess knowledge and abilities that will serve you well in the challenges ahead. But more importantly, you possess the wisdom to use them responsibly. Harry nodded, accepting both the praise and the implicit acknowledgement of difficulties yet to come. That evening, Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room, surrounded by friends who were still processing the news of his extraordinary past. Ron and Hermione flanked him on the couch, both wearing expressions of amazement and protective concern. "So you've been living in a secret room in the castle for 5 years," Ron said, shaking his head in disbelief. "And we had no idea you were there." "The Room of Requirement is very good at keeping secrets," Harry said with a smile. "It protected me until I was ready to protect myself." "And Dobby is really going to work here at Hogwarts?" Hermione asked, her voice bright with approval. "I think that's wonderful. He sounds like the most devoted guardian anyone could ask for." "He is," Harry said simply. "He saved my life in every way that matters." As the conversation continued around him, Harry found himself looking toward the window that showed the grounds of Hogwarts stretching away into the darkness. Somewhere in the castle, Dobby was settling into quarters of his own for the first time in his life. Somewhere in the Room of Requirement, Lily Potter's portrait waited to hear about the day that had changed everything. And here, in the warmth of the Gryffindor common room, Harry Potter was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by friends who accepted him for who he was, in a school that valued the courage and compassion he had learned during his years of hiding, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the strength that came from finally, completely, being home. For the first time since his parents' death, Harry Potter was not just surviving, he was thriving, and that perhaps was the most remarkable magic of all.